Okay, guys, tonight we journey not through temples or battlefields, but into the quiet, desperate corners of ancient Rome, where ordinary people didn't chase glory. They tried to escape the grave. While Rome gave us empire and architecture, it also gave us rituals, amulets, whispers in the dark ways. The forgotten masses tried to cheat death itself. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy deep dives like this, and drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing this little community stretch across time zones. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let's unravel how ancient people fought the one enemy no one could escape, the slave who buried amulets under his bed to ward off plague. They were the invisible ones, the ones without names on the census scrolls, without graves marked by stone, the ones who lived not for themselves, but entirely at the mercy of another's breath. Slaves in the ancient world weren't just laborers. They were currency, furniture, breathing property. They were worked, traded, punished, and forgotten. And yet, when plague came, even the masters looked to their slaves with something strange in their eyes. Not sympathy, not concern, but fear. Because when disease tore through ancient cities, it didn't respect class. It didn't care whether you wore silk or rags. It came in the night, and sometimes it started with the slaves. In households across Rome, Carthage, Egypt, even the grand villas of Greece, when the death toll rose and the air grew thick with incense and ash, it was often the slave quarters where fear turned into desperate ritual. You see, for a slave, death wasn't just a release. It could be a curse. Dying without proper rites meant your spirit might linger, stuck in the world of the living, twisted with bitterness. And for those still alive, especially those forced to share straw pallets in cramped stone rooms, the idea of a restless spirit was not just folklore, it was real. It breathed down their necks at night, so they acted quietly, secretly, without permission. Beneath the rough, woven mats and moldy straw, they buried objects, small ones usually, easily hidden, things whispered about in ancestral tongues, long since banned from temples and polite society, charms made of bone, iron nails bent into loops, scraps of papyrus inked with desperate prayers. Some were protective, others were curses, aimed at confusing the demon of death itself. These were not priests, they were not scholars, but they were practitioners of 1,000 oral traditions that had survived empires and exile. And when plague knocked at the door, they remembered. Archaeologists have unearthed traces of this. In the ruins of slave quarters beneath Roman villas in places like Pompeii and Herculaneum, tiny amulets, sometimes hidden within collapsed bedding, sometimes tucked beneath hearthstones, have been recovered. Some bear symbols linked to underworld deities like Hecate or Anubis. Others are stranger, marks with no clear origin, likely handed down through generations of oral ritual from tribes far beyond Rome's borders. And while no slave would have dared speak of them openly, especially under the eyes of their masters, the timing for their appearance during plague years is no coincidence. To a modern eye, these charms might look like superstition, but think about what they represented. In a world where slaves had no legal right to their own life, where their bodies were used, discarded, or killed on a whim, these amulets were a reclamation, a stolen moment of control in a life built on servitude. Even if they didn't stop the disease, they offered something else, a final choice, a way to tell death, not tonight, not me. And sometimes the charm wasn't just for the slave, In a few eerie cases, charms were found carved with the names of masters, buried not in hatred, but protection. If the master died, the entire household might be punished, families scattered, slaves sold. So protecting the master, even through magic, could be a selfish act of survival. Protect him, and you might live. Let him die, and you could be marched to a market stall by dawn. Survival wasn't loyalty, it was strategy. In ancient Egypt, slaves, often captured in war or born into bondage, practiced versions of protective rites inherited from Nubian and desert traditions. They believed in the Aksh, a sort of restless ghost that could return if death came violently or unjustly. Burial amulets were meant to guard not only against plague, but from being turned into one of these wandering dead. In some gravesites near Thebes, archaeologists found beads carved into tiny eyes, fragments of obsidian, and even crude animal figurines wrapped in linen, tucked not near the heart, but under the hips or knees, exactly where a straw mat might have rested. These weren't offerings to gods, they were shields, and they told a story no priest ever wrote down. Plague was more than a disease in the ancient world. It was a breakdown of order. In Roman texts, accounts of plague often mention the dead piled so high that carts couldn't pass, of dogs roaming the streets, dragging bodies by the limbs, of temples closed, of pyres burning day and night. For a slave, this chaos was an opportunity and a terror. If you died without someone to burn your body, you became a ghost. But if your master died first, you might escape or be killed to join him in the afterlife. Every outcome was laced with uncertainty, and so, beneath the hay and clay, they buried their hope, not just for survival, but for memory. If a charm worked, if they lived, they might whisper of it to another, pass it on, hide another beneath another bed, and thus a quiet tradition survived, of magic practice in secret, of death bargained with, and of the desperate belief that something, anything, might protect you when the gods did not. One Roman household inventory, written after a sudden death during a plague year, mentions the strange discovery of a twisted iron nail beneath the bed of the kitchen slave. The document lists it with confusion. Likely sabotage, the scribe writes, but it wasn't sabotage, it was fear, and perhaps faith, the kind of faith that emerges only when every other door has closed. And this is a truth that's often left out of the grand histories, not the empires or battles, but the quiet, invisible war fought beneath a slave's bed, with scraps and curses and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, death could be tricked, because in the darkest nights of the ancient world, when the streets were silent except for the wails of the sick and the burn of fevered breath, even the powerless reached for power. Even those with no name found ways to be remembered, not in stone or song, but in silence, in secrecy, and in the soft earth beneath a bed that no one dared search. They were the forgotten spellcasters of history, not witches, not priests, but survivors. And sometimes, that's the greatest magic of all. The baker who paid a witch to curse his competitors. In the narrow, soot-streaked alleyways of medieval towns, where the scent of rising bread might have offered a rare comfort amid squalor, a darker kind of heat simmered just beneath the surface. Beneath the clatter of carts and clamor of church bells, an invisible war was being waged between bakers. These were not kindly craftsmen in flour-dusted aprons, singing as they kneaded dough. No, in many corners of Europe, the bread oven became the battlefield, And bread itself, the weapon of survival, because for the medieval baker, success meant life, failure meant starvation. And when grain was short, ovens grew cold, and taxes remained high, some bakers turned not to church, but to witchcraft. It's hard to imagine today just how much control the village baker once had, or how thin the margin of error was. Flour prices could double overnight. One bad batch of bread could trigger gossip, ruin reputation, even cause accusations of poisoning. Worse still, a single accusation of short-weight bread, selling loaves that were too light, could result in public humiliation or brutal punishment. Bakers were flogged, pilloried, even branded. So while the local marketplace might look calm on the surface, behind the stalls and thatched shops, a quiet desperation brewed. Every loaf sold was a shield against poverty. Every customer gained was one stolen from a rival. And some rivals, it seems, were willing to burn more than just wood in their ovens. Historical records from parts of Eastern Europe and rural France, often buried in local court transcripts and ecclesiastical documents, tell of bakers secretly visiting known Weissensitze women, the so-called witches of the village fringe. These were not always the cackling hags of legend. They were herbalists, midwives, outcasts, and for a price, a handful of silver or a sack of rye, they would offer more than remedies. They would offer vengeance. Some bakers commissioned incantations to spoil the dough of a competitor. Others sought more final solutions. In one 14th century Flemish record, a baker named Jeroen was accused of hiring a hedge witch to sour the hands of his rival across the square. The spell was said to cause numbness and rot in the fingers, making it impossible for the man to knead dough. The rival baker's business collapsed within a month. Locals believed it was just bad luck, but the testimony of the accused witch, dragged out only after she was tortured, suggested otherwise. She spoke of wax dolls placed inside ovens, scratched with iron pins, of salt mixed with animal blood and hidden in chimney flues, of midnight prayers muttered backwards while bread rose. Why would a baker go to such lengths? Because bread was life. Not metaphorically, literally. In a world without refrigeration, canning, or mass agriculture, bread made up as much as 70% of the average person's calories. If a baker failed, he didn't just lose business, he doomed his family, his apprentices, his customers. A failed oven could mean malnourishment, disease, riot. During times of famine or plague, even the slightest edge in business meant everything. And if one could not out-bake a rival, then one might try to out-curse them. In Italy's Emilia-Romagna region, church archives speak of an entire baker's guild being placed under scrutiny after multiple members were caught engaging with a local striga, a cunning woman accused of crafting charm circles to sabotage ovens. These circles, drawn in ash and chicken bone near bakery doors, were believed to cool the flame of prosperity. Bread would not rise, dough would sour, fires would sputter, customers would grow suspicious, then disappear. The spell was subtle, but deadly. Of course, not all witches accepted such commissions. Some feared the wrath of the church inquisitors. Others refused to curse fellow tradespeople out of principle. But for the desperate, there was always someone willing to whisper a few damning words over a bundle of blackened herbs. And once a curse was cast, the damage often fed itself. One ruined baking day meant wasted flour, angry customers, and a ruined week. One rumor about illness tied to a loaf could undo a reputation forged over decades. And in medieval villages, reputation was currency. Even more chilling are the records from Germanic territories where witches were said to call down the smoke, a type of spell that directed spirits of hunger or rot into the homes of targeted bakers. Doors would slam open, flour sacks would burst, rats would infest storage rooms, firewood would fail to catch. The afflicted bakers, often unaware they'd been cursed, might begin praying harder, fasting, or even burning herbs themselves. Sometimes the spell worked not because of real magic, but because fear itself sabotaged their skill. A baker afraid of failure becomes a baker who fails. And then there's the moral rot. Once a baker stooped to hiring a witch, how could he ever return to normal commerce? If one curse worked, why not another? Why not curse the miller to raise flour prices for your rival? Why not curse the cooper who made their flour barrels to weaken the wood? It created a cycle: fear, sabotage, dependency, one where magic became a tool of economic warfare. The battlefield was not fought with swords, but salt circles, soot, and whispered hexes. It is telling that many of these cases came to light only when inquisitors swept through towns in later centuries. What appeared to be witch trials often uncovered something darker, not just heresy, but bitter rivalries fought in secret for years. Testimonies showed that some towns had multiple bakers, each accusing the others of cursing, sabotaging, or poisoning their craft. One trial in Bavaria exposed a tangle of accusations so intricate that it was clear the entire local economy of bread had become a theater of spiritual war. But what happened to the customers? Most had no idea. They continued to buy their loaves, perhaps commenting on the taste, the texture, the crust. They had no inkling that the warmth of that bread had passed through a war of hidden hands, that the baker who sold it may have, just the week before, buried a cursed feather in his rival's chimney, or whispered a blight into the flour sacks while pretending to lend a hand. So, when we look back at the medieval baker, we must strip away the romantic image of a quiet artisan and replace it with something more complex. These were men, and sometimes women, at the edge of survival, caught in a world where hunger was a constant threat, where reputation was fragile, and where the supernatural still clung to the seams of daily life. For some, faith in prayer was enough, but for others, when starvation loomed and competition tightened, they turned to the shadows, and they paid for power with secrets. Not all wars are fought with blades. Some are fought with flour and fire, and a whisper in the dark, traded for a coin, placed like a curse behind a rival's oven door. The midwife, who whispered incantations to save newborns. In the flickering candlelit corners of medieval Europe, birth was not the joyful, sterile event we might imagine today. It was perilous, sacred, and teetered constantly on the brink of the unknown. And the standing at the delicate threshold between life and death was a woman rarely recorded in official chronicles, but whose presence was essential to every village and every noble hall alike. The midwife. She was not merely a helper, she was a guardian, a healer, a spiritual gatekeeper, and at the deepest hours of the night, when a newborn's breath faltered and the shadows in the room thickened, she whispered ancient words. Fragments of charms and incantations passed from tongue to tongue, memory to memory. Not for show, not for superstition alone, but because she had seen what happened when she didn't. Medieval Europe was a world saturated with spirits, omens, and unseen forces. To live was to be constantly aware of invisible threats. And for infants, so new, so unformed, those threats were everywhere. The concept of crib death, what we now call sudden infant death syndrome, had no medical explanation. When a baby passed silently in the night, with no wound, no warning, it was unthinkable to believe it simply happened. It was evil. It was a spirit. It was a punishment. And the midwife, who had witnessed hundreds of births and just as many funerals, knew this all too well. Historical records from as early as the 12th century make quiet references to midwives muttering protection words or soul-fastening phrases over infants. These weren't simple prayers. They were verbal shields, woven with rhythm, ancient names, and often Latin mixed with regional dialects, even pre-Christian remnants. The midwife might cradle the baby and whisper phrases like "Anima teneatur in carne sua," may the soul remain in its flesh, or call upon saints, angels, and unnamed guardians, blending folk wisdom with holy invocation. In the eyes of the church, this was tolerated, barely. Midwives lived under suspicion, especially when too many children died in their care, or when too many survived where others had failed. They were accused, sometimes praised, sometimes persecuted, yet they were still needed. No priest, no physician would come during a woman's labor. That task fell to the midwife, and it was she who was believed to know the secret lines that could coax a baby to breathe, or protect it from the invisible hand that might snatch it away. Some midwives carried charm rolls, scraps of parchment or leather inscribed with protective symbols, which they would hide beneath swaddling cloths or beneath the straw of the birthing bed. In Anglo-Saxon England, such rolls contained protective words like "Kraft Christes," invoking Christ's power, or "Almes Gifan," a plea for divine mercy. These incantations weren't spells in the sorcerer's sense. They were seen as ancestral wisdom, surviving in an age where the line between the sacred and the profane was often blurred. A whispered phrase could mean the difference between a child who woke crying or one who never stirred again. But not all charms were spoken in Latin or Christian tongues. In parts of Eastern Europe, midwives were known to whisper in forgotten village dialects curses against demons like the Alp or Mora, believed to sit upon a baby's chest at night and steal its breath. In Slavic regions, protective chants included references to iron gates and silver threads said to bind the soul to the body and prevent it from drifting into death while the child slept. These utterances were old, far older than Christianity itself, and though many were never written down, they echoed through generations, carried in the mouths of midwives who had no schooling but knew how to navigate a world thick with danger. Crucially, midwives did not act alone. The incantations were often accompanied by ritual gestures, tracing signs over the baby's heart, tying protective knots into the swaddle, or placing blessed herbs such as mugwort or vervain under the pillow. Everything had a purpose. The baby was not just being welcomed into life, it was being protected from death, cloaked in layers of spiritual armor crafted from ancient syllables and half-remembered rites. Historians now look back at these practices with a blend of curiosity and awe, not because we believe the spirits were real, necessarily, but because these women, with no access to modern medicine, had developed complex, intuitive systems to confront something terrifyingly unpredictable. In a time when 1 in 3 children might not survive infancy, midwives did what they could with the tools they had: language, belief, rhythm, touch. Their whispered words may seem quaint or archaic now, but they were born of real desperation. every incantation was a battle cry in a war they fought daily against an invisible enemy. And when a baby passed despite their efforts, the midwife bore the weight of that loss, not just from the grieving mother, but from the community who might now look upon her with suspicion. Was the chant wrong? Did she forget a word? Did she carry a curse herself? Some midwives were even accused of infanticide under the shadow of failed charms. Inquisition records in Spain and France mention women questioned for speaking secrets over a newborn or uttering the old tongues after a death. And yet, these same women were summoned again at the next labor, trusted once more. Because in truth, no one else dared step into the blood and breath of the birthing room. It's easy to forget how fragile life was in the medieval world and how much that fragility shaped belief. To hold a living infant was a miracle. To keep it alive, something even more precious. And so, the midwife whispered, not because it was tradition, but because it was hope turned into sound. Hope that the child would survive the night. Hope that breath would not leave its body. Hope that the world, so full of invisible dangers, might spare this one soul. Some of those whispered charms have been lost to time. Others survive in fragmented manuscripts, buried within medical texts or mistaken for folk poetry. But what remains undeniable is the power behind them. Not magical power, necessarily, but the sheer force of intention. In those ancient syllables, carved through generations of suffering and wisdom, was the desire to defy death with nothing more than breath and belief. So when we imagine the midwife of old, we should not see merely a village woman with linen and herbs. We should see a spiritual warrior standing between life and the void, armed only with her voice. A voice trained not in cathedrals or courts, but in the sacred silence between a mother's scream and a newborn's first breath. And when that silence stretched too long, when the air hung too still, she would lean close, cradle the baby's head, and speak the old words once more, in hopes that this time the spirits would listen. The soldier who carried a tooth of a dead gladiator for luck, in the scorching sun of a Roman battlefield, amidst the iron clash of blades and the thick stench of blood and sweat, some soldiers carried more than weapons. Tucked in a leather pouch, hung from their necks or bound to their wrists, were relics not blessed by temples nor forged by blacksmiths. These were teeth, broken, yellowed, and torn from the jaws of the dead. But not just any dead. Gladiators. To the modern mind, this might seem grotesque, but in the mind of a Roman soldier, it was survival. And in the world they marched through, where the gods were cruel, omens were sacred, and death was always just an arrow away, superstition was not weakness. It was armor. It was hope. It was control over fate when the state gave you none. The tooth of a slain gladiator was no random fragment. It was a symbol of brutal endurance, of a man who had stood inches from death dozens of times and spat in its face. Gladiators were the embodiment of resistance against mortality. Though many were slaves or criminals, once they entered the arena, they became something more, a conduit between man and myth. To the crowd, they were living sacrifices. To the gods, they were entertainment. But to soldiers, they were warriors of a special kind. Warriors who had already bargained with death and for a time won. The Roman world was steeped in magical thinking. Before campaigns, generals consulted augurs, read bird patterns, dissected animal entrails, or watched how sacred chickens pecked at grain. No battle began without divine permission, and just as the Empire itself was protected by rituals. Each soldier sought personal protection. Some trusted prayers. Others wore phallic amulets. And then there were those who trusted bone. When a gladiator died in the arena, especially one who had won several matches before falling, his body was not treated with reverence. More often than not, it was dragged away, stripped, and disposed of. But to certain soldiers, watching from the stands, his corpse was a treasure. After the crowd cleared, some would bribe the attendants, sneak into the corpse pits, or even scavenge from cremation sites to recover a fragment. A tooth was ideal, small, hard, easy to conceal, but it held enormous symbolic power. The belief was simple. If a man could fight death and win, even briefly, then a piece of him could grant that same resistance to another. Soldiers believed the tooth contained the gladiator's final breath, his defiance, his courage. Some even thought that if they died while wearing it, their own soul would become harder to take. Others whispered that the spirit of the gladiator would walk beside them in battle, guiding their sword, warning their steps. This wasn't isolated superstition. The Romans lived in a world where death was more companion than stranger, and in such a world, talismans of death, if wielded properly, could be tools of life. Roman soldiers were not just brutes with shields. They were thinkers, observers, pragmatists. Many had seen fellow comrades impaled by javelins while wearing standard-issue armor, yet another soldier, clutching some odd trinket, walked through the same volley untouched. Coincidence? To them, no. It was proof. Roman military culture tolerated and even encouraged personal rights, as long as a practice didn't challenge state rituals or military discipline. Soldiers were given room for private beliefs. A legionnaire might wake at dawn, pray to Mars, tie on his sandal, and then quietly kiss a piece of tooth before battle. This blend of state religion, folk magic, and raw desperation became the invisible foundation of many lives in the ranks. Archaeological records have confirmed the presence of strange amulets in gravesites of Roman soldiers. While teeth are rarely preserved due to time and soil, references in Roman literature, particularly in writings by Pliny the Elder, hint at these macabre charms. Pliny mentions bone as a conduit of spiritual essence and even describes rituals where the bones of executed criminals were used in spells of protection or vengeance. If the bone of a condemned man held power, how much more potent was the tooth of a famed fighter? The gladiator's tooth was not just about defense, it was also about identity. Soldiers who bore them often saw themselves as part of an elite spiritual brotherhood. They were not mere pawns of empire, but chosen survivors, linked to a lineage of men who stared death in the eyes and refused to blink. It gave meaning to pain. It gave honor to the march. It made suffering sacred. Of course, such beliefs came with danger. If a tooth protected you in one battle, you might begin to believe it was the only thing keeping you alive, and when it cracked, got lost, or stolen, panic. Men would risk their lives to retrieve them. Some even claimed the loss of the tooth brought a curse, that the spirit of the gladiator, once bound, now sought revenge for being abandoned. These stories spread like wildfire through the ranks. Entire units grew nervous if one man's charm was broken. That's how deep this belief ran. The fear of death could spread faster than steel. But there was something poetic in it too. A Roman soldier, often nameless, fighting in lands far from home, with no legacy but a bloody tunic and a fading letter from a mother he hadn't seen in a decade, carried inside his cloak the tooth of another forgotten man, and between them in silence they shared a pact, I carry your death, so mine comes slower. I honor your last breath, so I may hold mine longer. Two strangers, both owned by the same empire, both resisting in the only way they could. Some modern scholars scoff at these tales, calling them embellishments or folk legend, but we should be careful before we dismiss them. These were not myths to those who lived them. They were strategies. When medicine failed, when armor failed, when gods were silent, a tooth whispered back. It told a man that he was not alone, that somewhere in the bone dust of a Colosseum, courage still lived, and that maybe, just maybe, death would hesitate. Today, we don't look at talismans as curiosities. We wear pendants, lucky socks, or family heirlooms with barely a thought. But to a Roman soldier, belief was not a luxury, it was a necessity. When your shield cracked and the javelins rained, sometimes the only thing between you and the afterlife was a tooth, a fragment of a man who died screaming for a crowd, now silently guarding a man screaming into war. And maybe that's the most human thing of all. Not the superstition, not the violence, but the desperate search to carry a piece of someone else's strength when we feel our own slipping. A soldier, a gladiator, both bones in the same empire, and between them a tooth, small, ancient, and in that moment more powerful than any god. The farmer who burned his hair to repel the underworld. You can tell a lot about a society by what it feared most. In medieval and early agrarian Europe, before medicine had even a name, before spirits were metaphor instead of fact, one fear eclipsed all others. It was not war, nor poverty, nor hunger, though all were constant companions. It was the sudden, unexplainable death of the human soul, a death that did not arrive with trumpet blasts or the visible sword, but that crept in silent, invisible form and took a person in their sleep. And when this death came, through plague, fever, or wasting sickness, the people didn't look first to healers. They looked to the realm of spirits, because what was sickness, they believed, if not a curse? A sign that something from the underworld had noticed you, something that intended to collect. And so they turned to the desperate rituals of the living poor, to smoke, to salt, to fire, and to hair, because hair was different. Hair was you. It was your scent, your breath, your essence. And if the spirits of the underworld were seeking your soul, then maybe, just maybe, you could send them somewhere else, confuse them, trick them, delay them. In rural corners of medieval France, Germany, and even parts of Britain, there are records, not always in noble manuscripts, but scratched into marginal notes, folk tales and ecclesiastical warnings of a peculiar and haunting ritual, a ritual not done by priests, but by the sick themselves, or their mothers, or their wives, a ritual where, during illness, a farmer would gather strands of his own hair, often the hair closest to the scalp, sometimes the beard, sometimes the pubic hair, and burn it in a small earthen bowl. The bowl was then set at the foot of the bed, or outside the door, or on the windowsill during a moonless night. And as the smoke rose, it was believed that it carried a message. This soul has already gone. The smell of burning hair, sharp, acrid, unforgettable, was considered both signal and smokescreen. To the living, it was horrific. To the dead, they hoped, it was disorienting. The soul collectors, according to many medieval superstitions, were not all-knowing. They were bureaucratic. They followed scent, identity, essence. If the essence was already gone, destroyed in fire, they might assume their target had slipped away, and move on to the next name. This belief wasn't a one-off story. It shows up in multiple scattered records across centuries. In one 14th century Saxon account, a farmer's wife claimed she burned his hair while he was delirious from fever, whispering prayers over the smoke. He survived. The local priest later condemned her for engaging in pagan rites, but the village didn't forget, nor did the family. In another tale from an Italian hill town, a young shepherd boy was said to have lit a fire of sheep dung and his own shorn locks, reciting a local incantation that loosely translated to, "The spirit that seeks me shall choke on my leaving." He too lived, and while the story grew in legend, it was remembered not as magic, but as survival. And that's what's important here. These weren't rituals for power. They were rituals for defense, for misdirection, for holding death at bay. We often imagine superstition as backward, as foolish. But superstition, real superstition, is almost always born from pattern recognition mixed with desperation. People didn't just invent these practices. They noticed them. They remembered who lived and who died. And sometimes, just sometimes, it was the one who set fire to their own hair that lived to tell the tale. And that kind of pattern, true or imagined, spreads faster than any written doctrine, because it speaks to fear and hope. The burning of hair wasn't isolated to Europe. Similar customs existed in parts of ancient China and the Middle East, where burning a strand of hair during illness or upon waking from a nightmare was thought to sever a tether between the soul and whatever dark force had begun to pull it. The idea that identity could be smudged or hidden, that spiritual predators could be misled with scent or ritual, appears again and again throughout human history. And though Christian authorities attempted to stamp out many such practices, especially as the Church consolidated power over the boundaries between life and death, they rarely succeeded. You can't ban fear, and you can't argue logic with a mother watching her child waste away. When the physician says, "There's no cure," and the priest says, "Let God's will be done," the people look elsewhere, and they reach for fire. This act of burning hair, of offering your own body as a smokescreen, was not just desperation. It was rebellion, a silent, smoky defiance of a fate others insisted was already sealed, a personal ritual in a world where most power was held far away, in churches, castles, and courts. This was something a farmer could do with his own hands, something that didn't require permission. But of course, such acts also carried weight. There were stories of the ritual going wrong, of spirits becoming angered, of those who burned the wrong hair or did so without speaking the proper words, falling even more violently ill, because the line between magic and madness was always thin, and those who dabbled in that realm walked it with trembling feet. Today, the idea may seem ridiculous. Burning your own hair to ward off death? A curious footnote, the long book of medieval oddities. But pause for a moment. Look deeper. What does it mean that a person in agony, dying, confused, or terrified would reach for a lock of their own hair and set it alight? It means they believed something could still be done, that death was not yet inevitable, that even in a world ruled by poverty, pestilence, and war, the soul was not a passive victim. It could act, it could resist. And maybe that's the real story here, not just about a farmer in some forgotten corner of Europe, coughing in the night and clutching a handful of his own tangled hair, but about the human instinct, eternal and burning, to survive, even if the only weapon you had was fire and fear, and a single thread of your own existence turned to smoke rising into the darkness, fighting for one more morning. The dying woman who drank mercury in secret. She waited until the candlelight thinned, until the room grew quiet, until no one was watching. Then, with trembling hands, she reached beneath the floorboard, not for medicine, not for prayer beads, but for a tiny vial of silver death, mercury, quicksilver, the liquid mirror once called the tears of the gods. To the modern world, it's a poison, a neurotoxin, a death sentence. But for her, in that hour, it was hope. It was the last defiance in a world that had run out of cures. This woman was not the first, nor the only one. Across medieval Europe and far earlier in the ancient world, desperate people, especially women, drank mercury in secret, not to end their lives, but to save them. They were not trying to die. They were trying to be cleansed. Because in a time before germ theory, before microscopes or vaccines, sickness wasn't seen as a biological invasion. It was seen as spiritual pollution, a curse, a demon, an imbalance of humors, a punishment from the heavens. And in that worldview, if something dark had entered you, you had to force it out, purge it, burn it, poison it. For centuries, mercury was considered one of the most mystical substances known to man. It was neither solid nor gas. It moved like water, gleamed like metal, and seemed to defy nature. Alchemists believed it could transmute matter, unlock immortality, and dissolve the very boundary between life and death. But for the poor, the dying, the desperate, it was a last resort, a sacred toxin, a well-tuned weapon against invisible forces no physician could see. In old medical texts, like the Compendium Medicinae or Trotula, remedies involving mercury or lead powders were sometimes recommended, not directly, but through whispered recipes, often targeted at female disorders, demonic possessions, or wasting illness. In truth, it was often for those illnesses no one could name. The coughing that never stopped, the blood that wouldn't clot, the skin that turned ash gray. And when the midwives and charm healers had no more answers, some women turned to the alchemical poisons locked away in hidden drawers. Mercury scraped from mirrors, lead shaved from pipes, or powders ground with iron and prayer. They didn't announce it. They didn't want permission. These were not public treatments. These were private rebellions. In an age where women were often forbidden from controlling their own bodies, where their illnesses were dismissed as hysteria or punishment, poisoning oneself became, paradoxically, a form of self-defense. If the sickness inside was demonic, then the poison could kill the demon, even if it killed her too. Archaeological studies have revealed disturbing patterns. Skeletons from the medieval period, particularly those of women buried in isolated or unblessed grounds, have been found with trace amounts of mercury in their bones, far too high to be accidental. These women weren't murdered. They weren't alchemists. They were patients, daughters, mothers, midwives, and their silent rituals of poison point to one unbearable truth. They were dying, and no one could help them, so they helped themselves. In Venice, mercury was once sold in glass-stoppered vials, labeled in Latin with the word vivus, alive. In fact, the very name quicksilver came from this illusion of motion, this living death in liquid form. To drink it was to invite a transformation, not just of body, but of soul. It was believed that the spirit of the illness, if driven mad by the poison, would flee the body, unable to inhabit such a toxic shell. This belief came not only from Europe, but from earlier Islamic, Chinese, and Indian medicinal philosophies, where mercury had been used for centuries in small, terrifying doses as a purifier of body and karma. But it was never safe. Mouth ulcers, nerve damage, paralysis, madness, and eventually death. Still, for many, It was a price worth paying, because dying from illness meant a slow, humiliating descent, rotting away while family members wept, while priests whispered prayers you couldn't answer. But dying with mercury in your veins meant you had done something. You had fought. You had taken your life into your own hands. And in a world where women had no say in their fate, even choosing how to die was a kind of victory. In 1348, as the Black Death crept across Europe, records from plague cities like Avignon and Florence mention the rise of silver sickness in women, an unofficial name given to those who grew delirious, then silent, after ingesting substances meant to purge demons. One Dominican friar wrote of a young widow who took the spirit of alchemy into herself, believing it would burn the plague from her blood. She died in agony. But her body, he noted, did not show the pustules common to the infected. Perhaps, he wrote with strange reverence, she burned the devil out. And even into the 17th century, the practice continued hidden, secret, passed from woman to woman in hushed tones. In places where medicine had failed, in rooms where screams were silenced, there quicksilver still flowed, not just through flasks, but through the whispered belief that something cursed could cure something worse. The story of the dying woman who drank mercury isn't just about superstition. It's about agency, about the unbearable isolation of illness, about the cold terror of watching your body betray you and knowing no one will save you. So, you save yourself, even if that salvation comes in the form of liquid metal. And maybe that's the most haunting part. Not the poison, not the pain, but the quiet, desperate courage it takes to drink something you know might kill you, simply because the silence of inaction hurts more. In the end, she didn't die screaming. She died staring into a wall, a thin rivulet of silver at the corner of her lips. And while no priest recorded her name, and no healer claimed her as patient, she left behind something no one could take, her choice. She chose to fight death with death, to burn her demons in silver, and in doing so became something more than a victim of sickness. She became a voice, buried in silence, still whispering from beneath the floorboards. The father who sacrificed a rooster for every cough. In the dim, smoke-darkened corners of medieval homes where soot clung to rafters and the air itself felt thick with old breath, there existed a ritual so raw, so intimate, it rarely made its way into written records. It was not sanctioned by the church. It was not taught in books, and yet it persisted, passed down through whispers, observed in the dead of night, enacted with trembling hands. It was believed that sickness was not just a physical misfortune, but a curse, a debt, and like any debt, it demanded payment, blood for breath, life for life. So when a child coughed, or a wife paled, or a father grew weak at the knees, one desperate answer remained: sacrifice. Not grand temple sacrifice, but domestic, small, immediate, desperate, a rooster, a hen, sometimes even a newborn goat or a dove. These were not just meals, they were offerings to the liars in Rome, the household gods, to the spirits of ancestors watching from the walls, or to unnamed ancient forces thought to linger in thresholds, in chimneys, in hearths. And those offerings were meant to trade. Take this life instead. Let mine remain. Let my child breathe. Take the blood of this creature so that the shadow looming at our door passes by. This particular story, though real and echoed in various parts of Europe, draws heavily from early Roman pagan traditions that never fully died, only changed names. Even well into the Christian Middle Ages, families across southern Italy, rural France, Tumandas, and parts of Eastern Europe practiced forms of domestic animal sacrifice, not to mock the church, but because ancient fears still lived where scripture could not reach. The ritual was intensely private. A father, kneeling in front of the hearth, whispering invocations his own father had whispered. A shallow cut to the rooster's throat, the blood dabbed onto doorposts or mixed with ashes and drawn into protective symbols, and then the silence, waiting to see if the sickness would retreat. Historical traces of this practice survive mostly through church condemnations. Priests wrote of heathen blood rites found in peasant homes. Monks recorded stories of travelers witnessing bloodied feathers nailed above sickbeds. Inquisition records mention families accused not of witchcraft, but of unholy exchange, killing beasts in return for the life of the sick. One 13th century Hungarian case tells of a man who sacrificed 7 roosters in a single week after each of his sons began coughing during a plague scare. He was later excommunicated but never charged with murder. Because even the inquisitors understood, he did what any father might. There is something achingly human in this ritual. It's the logic of despair. In a world where medicine was guesswork and herbs were unreliable, people turned to what they could control: a knife, a prayer, a rooster. The need to do something when a loved one was dying was overwhelming, and belief, deep, inherited belief, offered a path of action, however grim. If death is a force, perhaps it can be bargained with. Perhaps it has a price. What's even more haunting is how deeply embedded this idea was across cultures. In the Norse sagas, we find accounts of animals sacrificed to household spirits when illness took root. In Slavic folklore, the domovoi, the house spirit, could be appeased with blood or meat during times of pestilence. In parts of the Balkans, traditions persisted into the 19th century of sacrificing chickens and placing their blood at the feet of the sick, believing disease to be a wandering entity that could be misdirected or bribed. But it wasn't always a religious ritual. Sometimes it was psychological warfare against death itself. By sacrificing a living being, the father reasserted the control over a situation where he had none. It was an act of desperation, yes, but also of defiance. He could not fight the illness inside his child's lungs, but he could fight the silence, the helplessness, the waiting. He could take a blade, look the divine in the face, and say, "Take this instead." Of course, such acts carry deep emotional weight. Families mourned these animals. Children wept. Roosters were not faceless stock. They were daily companions, sources of eggs, warmth, routine. Killing them was not easy, but it was necessary, because if a single rooster's life meant your son would survive the night, what wouldn't you do? Even the church, over time, came to recognize the psychological grip of such rituals. Rather than stamp them out entirely, some priests transformed them, turning sacrifices into symbolic offerings. Instead of blood, holy water. Instead of roosters, bread shaped into birds. But in rural areas, the old ways held. Even as cathedrals rose, some fathers still knelt by the fire, knife in hand, listening for the cough that might mean the beginning of the end. It is easy, from our modern vantage point, to see this as barbaric, but to dismiss it would be to misunderstand the raw, trembling love that powered it. These sacrifices were not acts of cruelty. They were acts of protection, of trade, of pleading, and in many cases they became stories handed down. Tales of the night a father's offering saved the child. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. It gave hope, and in the brutal calculus of medieval life, hope was often the only medicine people could afford. So the next time you hear a cough, imagine a world where that sound could mean doom. where the air grew heavy and time seemed to slow and every breath felt like a countdown. Imagine being a father in that world. Would you not give something, anything, to keep your child breathing? In that moment, the knife in the hand was not a weapon. It was a prayer, and the rooster became the answer, the child who slept with garlic under the pillow. In the dim hush of medieval night, long before thermometers or antibiotics, when a child's forehead burned with fever and their breath came in gasps, parents didn't call for doctors. They reached for garlic, not to eat, not to cook, but to protect. Because to the medieval mind, illness wasn't just a physical condition. It was an invasion, an attack, and garlic, pungent and sacred, was believed to be one of the few weapons capable of holding back the invisible forces that came to steal a child's breath in the dark. This wasn't a superstition born in a single village. It was a fear shared across continents, from England to Byzantium, from Moorish Spain to Eastern Europe. Garlic was not just food, it was a shield. It was common to find a clove tied with twine and hung around the neck of a feverish child, or tucked under a pillow like a ward against unseen horrors. The strong odor was believed to drive away malevolent spirits, witches, demons, beings blamed for mysterious illnesses, especially those that struck suddenly in the night. The worse the smell, the stronger the protection, and to the parents, that smell meant survival. The roots of this belief go deep, far before medieval times. In ancient Egypt, garlic was buried with the dead. In Greece, soldiers carried it into battle for strength and protection. In Roman households, it was placed at thresholds to ward off curses. But it was in the medieval world, when disease had no face and death came without warning, that garlic took on its darkest and most desperate role. Children in particular were seen as vulnerable to spiritual attack. Their souls, it was believed, were not yet anchored. A sudden fever, it wasn't just sickness. It could be a demon latching on, or a spirit draining life through the breath. And so, when a child grew ill, garlic became the barrier between this world and the next. Some mothers would crush garlic and mix it with fat to smear over the soles of the child's feet or behind their ears. Others tied garlic to cradles, hung it over the bed, or stuffed it into mattress straw. These weren't acts of culinary instinct. They were rituals, emergency invocations performed in desperation, often alongside whispered prayers, charms, or even low chants, words passed down by grandmothers who'd buried too many infants to believe fever came by chance. Garlic wasn't just used at the moment of crisis. In many parts of rural Europe, infants were given garlic to suck on before they even had teeth. It was thought to cleanse the soul, to toughen the body, and to fill them with inner heat that would repel death. A crying baby with garlic in its fist wasn't just comforted, it was protected. And if the child slept peacefully that night, the garlic was praised. The church, for its part, tolerated this, but cautiously. Official doctrine called for prayers to saints, holy relics, and divine intervention, but the garlic remained, quietly, in shadow, a bridge between folk magic and faith, between the sacred and the earthy. No priest spoke of it from the pulpit, but even clerics, when their own children fell ill, did not always take the garlic away. And it wasn't just parents and midwives who used it. In pest houses and plague towns, garlic was crushed and burned to clean the air. Physicians of the time, when confronted with dying patients, wore masks stuffed with garlic and other herbs, not just for the smell, but because they believed the odor itself warded off miasmas, the deadly vapors thought to carry disease. In this belief system, garlic didn't merely ward spirits, it disrupted death itself. Some of these traditions were carried into written form. Herbal manuscripts, like the Leech Book of Bald or the Tacuinum Sanitatis, mention garlic for fever, for infection, for evil wind. But between the lines of medical utility lay the deeper truth. Garlic was a charm, a last line of defense for those who had no other weapon, and nowhere was it used with more urgency than when a child hovered near the edge. Imagine the scene: a one-room cottage, a child flushed with heat, the mother pacing, biting her lip, trying not to cry. She grabs a braid of garlic from the rafters. One clove goes beneath the child's pillow. Another is tied to a bit of linen and slipped around the tiny neck. The smell is sharp, overwhelming, but to her it is not unpleasant. It is hope, the last kind she has. If the fever broke by morning, she would give thanks to God, yes, but also to the garlic. If the child lived, the clothes would be burned, buried, or hung in the chimney to preserve the victory. And if the child died, the garlic would not be blamed. It would be mourned, like an old friend who tried but failed. Centuries passed, medicine advanced, and the mysteries of fever were slowly explained. But even today, in some places, garlic still lies beneath pillows. Some still hang it on cribs. And while most no longer believe in demons of the seas, the ritual survives, transformed perhaps into something symbolic, nostalgic. But once, not so long ago, it was everything: a bulb, a breath, a barrier against the unknown. So when you next smell garlic in the air, think of it not just as flavor, but as armor. Remember the children it once protected, and the mothers who watched the dark, hoping the sharp scent would keep death at bay. The sailor who tattooed death gods on his chest. Beneath the burning Mediterranean sun, a Roman trireme sliced through the waves, its oars groaning in perfect rhythm. Below deck, the stench of sweat, salt, and blood clung to every beam of wood. And standing there, half naked, skin like leather, eyes hardened by storms, was a sailor with a death god inked across his chest, not as decoration, not as pride, but as a plea, a shield, a psychological spell carved into flesh to confuse the very force that hunted them all, death itself. This wasn't mere body art. This was war magic for the sea. In the vast superstitions of ancient Rome, sailors existed at the bleeding edge between life and the underworld. Unlike the orderly Roman soldier who had temples, shrines, and priests, the sailor was alone with the whims of the sea: storms, whirlpools, pirate blades, monsters from deep myths. Everything conspired to kill him. And when your death might come, not from an enemy, but from the sky splitting open and swallowing your ship whole, logic no longer sufficed. You needed the gods, but not their help. You needed to outwit them. That's where the tattoos began. The practice of tattooing in the Roman Empire was usually reserved for slaves, criminals, or military branding. But among sailors, a parallel tradition emerged, one laced with deep occult significance. These were not state markings. They were spiritual wards. Sailors believed that by tattooing the image of a death god, like Orcus, lord of the underworld, or even a fearsome depiction of Neptune, god of the seas, they could trick death into thinking they were already claimed. It's a chilling idea. If death thinks I already belong to him, perhaps he'll pass me by. Orcus was especially feared. Unlike Pluto, who ruled the afterlife with bureaucratic coldness, Orcus was the punisher, the enforcer. He collected the souls of oath-breakers, traitors, and those who dishonored the gods. His image, often with a snarling face, black wings, or a barbed whip, was meant to shock even divine eyes. A sailor who bore him on his chest was, symbolically, announcing, I have already been taken. I'm already his. It was a bold deception, a bluff played against cosmic forces. Neptune, on the other hand, wasn't an image of trickery, but appeasement, Raging and vengeful, Neptune could capsize a fleet with a flick of his trident. Tattooing Neptune on the skin wasn't just devotion, it was bribery, a way to display fealty carved in blood as if to say, "Spare me, Lord of Waters, for I wear your face over my heart." These tattoos weren't chosen lightly. They were often applied with crude tools, bones sharpened to points, dipped in ash or rust. The process was agonizing, prone to infection, and in some cases fatal. But for those who survived the needle, they believed they were now marked, not just by ink, but by fate. Sailor culture in the ancient world was flooded with omens. Birds flying the wrong way could doom a voyage. Dropping a nail overboard could summon a storm. Whistling was forbidden. It was said to summon the winds, sometimes too violently. And tattoos became a physical extension of that belief system, a permanent charm against impermanence. Many Roman naval sailors came from the fringes of the empire. Greeks, Phoenicians, Egyptians, men raised in lands where magic was not myth, but practice. These sailors carried with them ancestral rituals, whispered curses, and knowledge of gods even older than Rome. Some tattoos blended Roman and foreign iconography. A sailor might ink a hybrid creature, a jackal-faced Neptune or an Orcus with hieroglyphic wings, trying to harness not one god, but many, to hedge their spiritual bets. This wasn't vanity. These were men who had watched entire crews vanish into mist, who had seen men struck by lightning or pulled overboard by unseen forces. Death at sea was cruel, random, and theatrical. In such a theater, a tattoo was both costume and disguise. If you couldn't be spared by gods, perhaps you could at least fool them. There's even evidence that some sailors tattooed skulls, inverted torches, or the words, "I belong to Hades," across their chests or backs. To Roman minds, the power of written words was immense, spoken or inked. To label yourself as claimed by the dead was to try and ward off the final claiming. Some would even go further, cutting into the inked skin to let it bleed, believing the pain would activate the mark during storms or naval battles. And these marks didn't just protect, they created identity. A sailor returning home bore more than scars. He bore symbols of what he'd endured and what he'd outlived. For some, the tattoo was a resume. "I have crossed death's waters," it said, "and I am still here." It gave them status in port taverns, respect in the shipyards, and fear in their enemies. No one wanted to duel a man who wore the underworld on his chest. These traditions, over time, faded. As Christianity spread across the empire, tattoos were rebranded as pagan filth, signs of sin, idolatry, or slavery. The spiritual dimension of the ink was erased, condemned, forgotten, but the bodies remained. Archaeological findings from burial sites near ancient ports have revealed bones with heavy scarring, some aligned with known tattooing practices, and in the surviving writings of sailors and poets, the imagery persists. Lucan, in his epic Pharsalia, speaks of men whose chests bore gods, whose skin dared challenge the fates. Tacitus notes naval units with foreign customs, including skin markings to guard against ill winds. And in seafarer curses scrawled onto temple walls, we find illustrations eerily similar to those found centuries later on Viking sails and pirate flags, skulls, serpents, gods with staring, lidless eyes. The ancient sailor was not just a laborer, he was a magician, a gambler, and a philosopher in salt-worn flesh. When he bled both ink and fear. When he laughed, it was often against the crashing thunder. And when he died, the gods who came for him had to look him in the chest and see their own face staring back. So the next time you see a tattoo, remember this. Once, it wasn't fashion. It was ritual. a last line of defense against a universe too vast, too cruel, and too indifferent to explain. In the Roman world, ink could be a lie, a prayer, or a battle cry, but to those who sailed the empire's edge, it was armor, pressed into the skin with trembling hands, and whispered promises that, for just one more storm, death might be fooled. The widow who wore her dead husband's ashes as a necklace in a world where grief had no therapist, no hotline, and no name other than mourning. Love didn't vanish with the body. It lingered, suspended in the clothes left behind, in the bed left half slept, in the whisper of the door that no longer opened. And for one widow in a quiet wind-stripped village, love lingered in a far stranger way, not in memories, but in ash, a fragment of her husband's charred remains carried daily against her chest in a tiny pendant worn under her dress, hidden from the curious eyes of the living. She believed, as many in her time did, that death could not only take, it could protect. In certain corners of late medieval Europe, especially in isolated alpine and forested regions, people held the unsettling belief that to keep a small piece of the dead was to carry a shield, not from swords or storms, but from early death itself. The logic was twisted, poetic, and profoundly human. Death, having already touched this home, would pass it by again. Spirits, ever jealous, would not claim what another already possessed. Ashes, then, were more than remnants. They were residue of a soul suffering, its journey, its departure, and to wear them was not simply to mourn. It was to wrap oneself in a spiritual ward. It was armor made from love and sorrow. And this widow, known in the oral accounts of a Bavarian village, though her name never survived in parchment, was said to have sewn a small leather pouch, hand-stitched and sealed with wax. Inside, she'd place a pinch of the grey dust collected from her husband's cremation pyre, an act already controversial, as burial was far more common and encouraged by the church. The ashes were sacred to her, not in doctrine, but in memory. Day and night, she wore them beneath her clothing, suspended by a thread of horsehair. She was not a witch, not a healer, not even a known eccentric. She was simply a woman, terrified of death, not for herself, but for her children. They had already buried their father. She could not allow them to bury their mother, and so every day she pressed the ashes against her skin and whispered that as long as she wore him, she could not join him. This practice, wearing ashes, wasn't invented by her. It stretched across cultures, centuries, even continents. In ancient India, and in certain early Roman death cults, ashes were known to carry both memory and power. In early Slavic folk customs, bone dust or ash mixed with soil was placed under beds to guard against sudden death. In pockets of Europe where plague struck again and again, stories spread of those who believed the touch of a beloved dead could render them invisible to the reaper. But hers was not a grand ritual. It was quiet, secret, a woman against the world and its dangers. And while the church frowned upon such acts, declaring the mixing of remains and the living body as impure, even blasphemous, the law rarely intervened. For how could you police grief? How could you tear open a locket and call it heresy, when it only held dust and memory? What makes this story resonate is not just its peculiarity, but its aching truth. The widow didn't think she was practicing magic. She thought she was surviving. She thought, in the absence of medicine, she might stitch a charm from heartbreak. She lived in a time when death came quietly and often, when the air could betray you, when a cough could orphan a family. And so, you held on to anything that gave you control, even if it was just a pinch of ash. And those ashes weren't sterile. They were once laughter, once flesh, one's touch. He had carried water from the well. He had cut wood beneath winter frost. He had whispered stories to her in the dark. Now he was soot. But soot too has weight, and in her small act, pinching him from the hearth and tucking him close, she rewrote death into something more bearable, less final. Historians now believe that such stories, though rare in the written record, were more common in practice than the church wanted to admit. Local clergy often turned a blind eye to mourning rituals, especially among the poor, where customs blended Christianity, paganism, and raw survival. Ashes were kept in jars, in hymns, sometimes even baked into small protective loaves, never meant to be eaten, just placed beneath cradles or windowsills to ward off sickness. But wearing them, that was different. That was personal, intimate, defiant. It said, "You may take him, but not from me." And that defiance, quiet as it was, became legend. Not because she lived forever, no one does, but because she lived longer than anyone expected, long enough to raise her children, long enough that neighbors began to whisper that maybe it worked. Maybe love could become protection. Maybe grief could become defense. Her locket eventually made its way into a parish record, not for its miracle, but because, after her death, it was discovered by a priest who described it with horror. He condemned it as a remnant of heathen sorrow. He ordered it burned, but it was too late. Her story had already spread, and across villages, others began to sew their own tiny pouches, not all with ashes, some with hair, some with bone dust, some with just a button or a threadbare piece of cloth that had once been worn by the dead. Because if death was unpredictable, then memory had to become ritual. The necklace was gone, but the idea remained that maybe death could be confused or bargained with, or at the very least reminded that someone had already paid the price. And that is what makes her story so powerful. Not just that she carried ash, but that she refused to let death define what remained. In the silence after the funeral, in the chill of nights that followed, she did what humans have always done, turned love into a weapon, not to harm, but to endure. Because sometimes survival isn't loud. It doesn't look like bravery. It looks like a woman in black, standing in a field, pressing a small warm pendant to her chest and whispering the name of the one she lost, as if that alone might keep her breathing. The gladiator who paid a sorcerer for immortality spells. He knew tomorrow he would die, not as a soldier, not as a martyr, not as a man, but as a spectacle, a nameless figure beneath the screaming sun, his blood poured out, not for glory, but for applause. He wasn't dying in defense of his homeland, his family, or his God. He was dying for the thrill of strangers. Stripped of armor, freedom, and dignity, he had one thing left, a single coin hidden in the hem of his tunic. Not enough to bribe a guard, not enough to buy his way out, but it was enough for something else, something forbidden, enough to pay a sorcerer, and that's exactly what he did. In the underbelly of ancient Rome, in alleyways that never saw daylight, lived men who didn't speak their real names, sorcerers, necromancers, practitioners of rites older than the city itself. These weren't temple priests or oracles. They didn't wear robes of linen or carry sacred scrolls. Their fingers were stained with ash, their breath smelled of burned herbs, and they spoke to gods who answered in silence. And to them came gladiators, men with no more chances, who had nothing left but the terror of a slow death and the desperate hope that something could reach beyond it. The gladiator didn't want to win, not anymore. He had seen how they fought, how they cheered when men begged, how they tossed coins as bodies twitched in the sand. He knew survival in the arena was rare and usually short-lived. Even champions fell eventually, What he wanted was continuation. If he died, he wanted his soul to remain sharp and awake. If he was cut down, he wanted his caged killer to choke on his own breath days later. If he was erased from the records, he wanted his name to survive in whispered fear. That was the spell he bought. One spell carved into a thin sheet of lead, folded and soaked in wine. It was slipped under his tongue, while the sorcerer whispered in a tongue not even Latin dared translate. It would bind his name to his killer, anchor his soul to the place of death, and mark the sand where he fell as claimed, not by the gods, but by vengeance. It sounds like fantasy, but it wasn't uncommon. Across the Roman world, especially in cities like Capua, Pompeii, and Ephesus, archaeologists have uncovered dozens of lead curse tablets known as deficciones, buried beneath arenas or near gladiator quarters. These tablets carry strange inscriptions, some invoking underworld gods like Hecate or Pluto, others bearing names of fighters alongside commands like bind his hands, twist his sword, or carry my soul past the veil with fury. Many include personal names never listed in official records, likely those of slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war, condemned to fight and forgotten. But not all of them were written by spectators or rivals. Some were written by the gladiators themselves. The logic was ancient. If your death was certain, you could make it mean something. You could strike twice, once with the sword, once with the soul. Magic was a way to tilt the scales when fate no longer answered to prayers, and the spells weren't only for revenge, some were for survival. Accounts from Roman writers like Pliny and Tacitus mention rumors of fighters who could not be killed, whose wounds healed too fast, whose eyes glowed in torchlight, whose names made even lions hesitate. Of course, these were likely legends, but the belief was real enough that certain fighters were accused of spirit binding, a ritual in which one's life force was tethered to a relic, a charm, or even another person. So long as that object remained whole, so did they. One haunting example comes from a dig beneath the old arena in Carthage. A small leather pouch was found in the foundation, sealed with iron wire. Inside were 3 human teeth, a scrap of parchment inscribed with a spiral of characters, and a pebble marked with the name Cassianus, a known gladiator who, according to records, died spectacularly in the ring. But witnesses said he did not scream, did not bleed, did not even flinch when struck. It took 4 blades to bring him down. Some believed he was already dead and simply hadn't realized it. There were consequences, of course. Sorcery, especially necromancy, was punishable by death in Rome. But for a gladiator, death was already a certainty. What could the law take that the arena hadn't already claimed? Some lanisti, those who trained and owned the fighters, even encouraged such rites, believing they created psychological advantages. A fighter who believed he had bound his soul to a charm fought harder, lasted longer, and terrified his opponent. Sometimes that belief alone was enough to turn the match. In other cases, it led to paranoia. Opponents refused to fight certain gladiators, claiming their armor burned to the touch, or their eyes followed them in dreams. And in the worst cases, the curses didn't stop with death. After particularly violent games, arena workers sometimes refused to remove certain bodies, not out of respect, but fear. They believed some gladiators had become lemures, restless spirits, invisible but furious. The workers would drag the corpse to the edge of the arena and leave coins over the eyes, hoping it would quiet the soul. Some were found days later, the coins scattered, the body unmoved. In more than one instance, the sand itself was dug up and replaced, priests summoned, altars burned, all because of a dead man who whispered to something deeper than Rome. The gladiator who paid the sorcerer didn't survive, but the man who killed him choked to death 2 days later on a piece of mutton in front of a banquet crowd. The story spread, the spell was blamed, and the name of the gladiator, never spoken during his life, was scratched into the underside of a nearby stairwell. Just 3 letters, V-I-R. No one remembered who he was, but they remembered what he did. In the end, that was the point. He died like the others, but unlike the others, he did not vanish. His coin bought no freedom, no favor with the gods, but it bought fear, a legacy written in nightmares and omens, a victory not of body, but of spirit. And in that final, forbidden purchase, he became what no gladiator was ever allowed to be, unforgettable. The sick man who slept in a temple hoping for a dream cure. In the still hours before dawn, beneath vaulted ceilings, painted with fading gods and gold-flaked constellations, a sick man lay motionless on a stone bench inside a temple. He had traveled far, through dust-choked roads and crowded Roman forums, not for medicine, not for potions, but for sleep. A very particular kind of sleep. Around him, others rested in silence, some coughing softly, others wrapped in cloaks against the cool breath of stone. This was not a hospital, it was not a clinic. This was a place where pain met the divine. The sanctuary of Asclepius, and the ritual they were performing had a name older than the Republic itself, incubatio. In ancient Roman and Greco-Roman tradition, incubatio was the sacred act of sleeping within a god's temple in the hope of receiving a vision, a dream so vivid, so precise that it would reveal a cure. To the modern ear, it may sound poetic, perhaps desperate, but to the ancient world, it was the medicine of the highest order. A dream from Asclepius, the god of healing, was considered more effective than 100 salves or a surgeon's blade, and those who came, rich or poor, soldier or mother, child or elder, came because they believed the god still spoke. If you knew how to listen while you slept, the ritual began long before the first night's sleep. The sick man would undergo purification, often bathing in cold water, abstaining from meat, sex, and wine. He would offer a sacrifice, commonly a rooster, the traditional gift to Asclepius. The temple priest would record his name, ailment, and request. He would then be led into the abaton, the inner sanctum, where only the sick seeking divine dreams were allowed. There, amid the scent of burning herbs and soft chanting, he would lie down. Some curled into themselves in fear. Others spread out like children beneath stars, arms wide, waiting for the god to arrive. And then they waited. Sleep in this space was no simple act. It was sacred terrain, a thunder-thin veil between the physical world and the divine realm. If you were fortunate, or perhaps worthy, you would receive a visitation. The dream might be symbolic or shockingly direct. Asclepius might appear in human form, touching the ailing part of your body. He might speak or simply gesture. You might see images, a snake wrapping around your chest, a tree sprouting from your stomach, a glowing stream running through your limbs. Each had a meaning, decoded later by priests trained in dream interpretation. Some dreams gave clear commands. Drink water from the left spring. Eat only figs for 7 days. Bury a coin beneath your bed. And sometimes, a miracle. Inscriptions from temples such as Epidaurus, Pergamon, and Rome itself bear witness to dozens of such cases. Stone slabs record stories not just of healing, but of transformation. One man came with a paralyzed leg, dreamed that the god struck it with a rod, and awoke with movement restored. A woman, barren for years, dreamed of a snake curling around her womb. She conceived within a month. Another man, tormented by insomnia and madness, dreamed of Asclepius lulling him to sleep beneath a tree. When he woke, he claimed to feel peace for the first time in a decade. Skeptics might suggest placebo, psychosomatic healing, the power of belief, but the ancient world didn't see it that way. For them, these were interventions, not hallucinations, but holy messages, and the temples became not just places of healing, but repositories of divine communication. What's striking is how inclusive these sanctuaries were. Unlike many Roman religious institutions, the Asclepian temples welcomed slaves, foreigners, women, even criminals. Illness, after all, was the great equalizer, and dreams did not discriminate. It was the sincerity of the seeker that mattered, not their social rank. A senator's son might sleep beside a wounded ex-soldier, both praying for the same thing, that a god would walk through their dreams and tell them how to live. But incubatio wasn't always comforting. Some dreams were terrifying. One inscription speaks of a man who dreamed he was being buried alive by serpents, only to wake and vomit blood, believing the poison had been drawn from him. Another dreamed of drowning in a black river before awakening, cured of seizures. Healing, it seems, did not always come gently. Over time, the temples of Asclepius evolved into full-blown healing complexes. They had bathhouses, gymnasiums, libraries, music, theater, and natural beauty were used as a medicine for the soul. But at the heart of it all, always, was the abaton, the place of sleep, the place where the veil between mortal and divine might part, just long enough to offer a whisper, a cure, a new breath. And what became of the man lying there, in the dark, on the marble slab? No inscription tells his specific story, but we can imagine. He drifts into sleep, the stone cool beneath him, the air heavy with incense and ancient hope. He has tried everything else, prayers, physicians, potions, and now he lies quietly, entrusting his body to a dream, hoping the god will visit, hoping that when he wakes, he will not just be healed, but changed, because that was the deeper secret of incubatio. It wasn't just about curing the body, it was about reorienting the soul, about learning to see your suffering not as punishment, but as a path. The dream didn't only show you how to heal, it showed you why you had suffered in the first place. It offered meaning in a world often ruled by chaos, and maybe that's why, even after centuries passed and temples crumbled, the core idea never fully died. Even today, when we say, sleep on it, or listen to your gut, we echo the ancient belief that sometimes the answers we need are waiting behind our eyelids. The sick man closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in faith, because in that temple, in that moment, sleep was not surrender. It was pilgrimage. It was a door. And some claimed they heard the god knock. The mother who hung coral branches on every door. She moved through the silence of her home like a prayer, walking on trembling feet. The world outside had grown quiet again, not from peace, but from absence. Too many doors stayed shut. Too many voices were missing. And in that terrifying quiet, she moved from threshold to threshold, clutching the deep red branches in her hand as if they were the fire itself. Coral, cold, twisted, sea-born coral, hung above every door, tied above every cradle, pressed gently into every pillow where her children slept, not as decoration, not as tradition, but as a divine warning to the spirits that came in the night. Not this house, not this breath, not this child. In the medieval world, the line between life and death was always too thin, too fragile, too easily shattered by an unseen wind or a midnight fever. And while physicians argued humors and scholars quoted scripture, it was the mothers, nameless, exhausted, sacred, who waged war in silence against death itself. and their weapons were not swords, they were rituals, and chief among them, coral. Red coral wasn't just beautiful, it was holy. It was believed to be born in the collision of sea and blood. According to ancient legend, when the head of Medusa fell into the ocean, her blood turned seaweed into coral. That mythology survived across millennia, morphing into a symbol of protective magic. To medieval Europe, coral was not just a relic of the sea, it was the hardened memory of divine transformation, a living prayer turned solid. It was thought to carry within it the power to seal doorways from spirits, to stop death at the threshold, to keep illness from crawling into a child's lungs while they slept. Mothers would hang coral branches over the main entrance of the home to confuse or repel malevolent forces. In Italy, France, and parts of Spain, it was common to see tiny bits of coral tied with red thread, red on red, above door frames and windows. That color wasn't chosen for aesthetics. It was the color of life, of blood, of warmth, and the belief was clear. Death spirits would not pass through red. It burned their vision. It marked the living as protected. But the practice didn't stop at the door. Coral was tied above every cradle, every bedpost, every beam. It was sewn into infants' clothing, strung into necklaces, placed beneath pillows, and braided into rosary beads. In the homes of the wealthy, coral was sometimes carved into small figurines, angels, saints, symbols of divine power. But in the homes of the poor, it remained raw, natural, sacred in its imperfection. It didn't need polish, it only needed presence. Some mothers buried coral beneath thresholds when building a home. Others soaked it in holy water during baptisms or feast days, believing it would amplify its strength. It wasn't rare to find a coral branch passed down through generations, chipped and worn, each crack a reminder of the sicknesses it had repelled, the children it had protected. There were no guarantees. Sometimes, even with coral in every corner, a child would die, and the coral would be blamed, not as a failure, but as a soldier that had fought as hard as it could. In these cases, mothers might bury the coral with the child to guide their soul through the darkness. Other times, the coral would be burned, broken, or given to the church, its work complete. The fear behind these acts was not superstition, it was lived experience. Plagues, fevers, and sudden death were constant visitors. The idea that death had a will, that spirits could be turned away by ritual and color and texture, was not irrational in a world with no cures. And so these rituals weren't desperate, they were logical. Emotional technology built from centuries of observation and grief. In apothecary texts and healing manuals, coral was listed as a tool of medicine and mysticism alike. It was said to calm the heart, to repel poison, to protect the soul. In some places, coral was ground into powder and mixed with wine as a fever remedy. But even then, it was more than substance. It was belief crystallized. It was a mother's hope given form, and the belief ran deep. In the art of the period, the infant Christ is often shown wearing coral, especially in Italian paintings. This was not accidental. It was not decorative. It was a sign that even the Son of God needed protection from death's early reach. Coral didn't just adorn, it defended, and every mother, rich or poor, learned that message early. Don't trust the night, don't trust silence, protect with coral. The practice echoed across cultures. In Jewish households, coral was included in amulets known as kamiyas, often given to newborns. In Islamic medicine, coral was listed among divine stones with power over jinn and sickness. And in pagan survivals woven quietly into a Christian ritual, coral served as a link between water and fire, ocean and blood. life and spirit. It belonged to no one religion and every faith at once. It was universal, and still, it was deeply personal. To the mother who hung it, coral wasn't a trend or a ritual to be admired. It was a lifeline. Every night she checked the chords. Every night she ran her fingers over the cool, unyielding surface. Sometimes she kissed it. Sometimes she wept against it, but always she trusted it, because coral didn't argue. It didn't falter. It stood silent, red, unblinking, even when her voice cracked from prayer and her hands trembled with fear. In a world where so many things could be taken, names, health, warmth, even memory, coral was something she could place with her own hands, a barrier she could build, a wall she could raise, even if it was only symbolic, even if it was all she had. And so she continued, night after night, door after door, not because she was certain it would work, but because doing nothing was worse. Coral was action. Coral was defiance. Coral was love made visible. Today, those old coral charms lie in museum drawers or buried deep in forgotten soil, but they were once lifelines. They were once armor. And for the mothers who held them, kissed them, hung them in doorways as the plague carts passed outside, those twisted red branches weren't superstition. They were survival. The merchant who refused to name the dead aloud. In the teeming markets of ancient Rome, amid the clang of coin against bronze and the murmurs of trade whispered beneath tent awnings, there moved a kind of silence that had nothing to do with modesty and everything to do with fear. It was not the hush of reverence, nor the stillness of respect. It was the deliberate, chilling silence wrapped around one subject alone, the dead. For among merchants, traders, moneylenders, and shopkeepers, there was one rule spoken in half-truths and sidelong glances. Never say their names, not your father's, not your rival's, not even your child's, because in the Roman mind, to speak the name of the dead aloud was to call them back, to understand why a merchant in a bustling Roman forum might suddenly grow pale at the mention of a deceased associate, or why he might redirect a conversation rather than utter the name of a lost sibling. One must first understand how the Romans viewed the dead, not as gone, but as hovering. The boundary between the living and the dead was porous, thin, easily breached by accident, grief, or negligence, and a name was a powerful key. Roman culture held that a person's nomen, their name, was more than an identifier. It was an echo of the soul itself. To speak it aloud, especially without ritual, could draw the attention of the spirit it once belonged to. Some spirits, honored and buried properly, might respond with blessing or indifference, but others, forgotten, dishonored, angry, might follow the sound back like a trail of thread leading to the one who disturbed them. These were the lemurs, the hungry dead, the restless, and they were feared. Merchants of all people understood the weight of consequences. Their lives depended on contracts, omens, the rhythm of fortune. One bad deal, one bad harvest, one cursed object, and a stall could collapse into ruin. They were not philosophers or poets. They were pragmatists, and they saw how bad the luck clung to those who invoked the dead too freely. So a custom emerged: avoid naming the dead aloud. It wasn't law. It didn't need to be. It was tradition enforced by subtle dread. Instead of names, euphemisms were used. The departed one, he who preceded me, the former owner, the one beyond. In funeral speeches and epitaphs, the phrase dis manibus, to the spirits of the dead, was often inscribed, but the full name might be altered slightly or left out entirely. This was not to erase memory, but to prevent entanglement, to let the dead rest, undisturbed by the vibration of their name in the mouths of the living. This wasn't limited to conversation. It extended into record-keeping and commerce. Some merchants kept ledgers where debts owed by the dead were scratched out completely, not for moral reasons, but because referencing their names might invite their return. If one must speak of the dead in business, it was common to burn incense or knock wood afterward to ward off bad luck. Some even spat or whispered the protective phrases to counteract the summoning. These weren't dramatic rituals. They were quiet, habitual defenses, born of a generational caution. And there was reason for this fear. Romans were highly attuned to omens, dreams, and unexplained misfortune. If a shopkeeper spoke the name of a dead father, and later that week his scales malfunctioned or his wife fell ill, it was seen not as coincidence, but consequence. Word would spread. Superstition is contagious. A merchant's reputation could rot as fast as spoiled grain. Even in literature, this caution is echoed. In the writings of Pliny the Younger, we find the references to ghost stories, where the name of the deceased, once uttered, leads to physical hauntings. In Ovid's Fasti, the Lemuria festival is described in great detail, a ceremony in which households try to purge lingering spirits. Notably, the rituals avoid direct naming of any dead. The patriarch instead chants symbolic phrases and throws black beans to distract ghosts. The point is not to confront, but to divert, not to engage, but to appease. And in Roman homes, especially those of merchants, protective symbols were carved near doorways: eyes, snakes, phallic charms, not merely for luck, but to confuse spirits who might wander in. Some kept household shrines where they made daily offerings to ancestral spirits, but even there, the names were spoken softly, with deference, often during daylight only. Night was too risky. Darkness was the hour of the dead. Merchants also inherited the beliefs of the people they traded with. In multicultural cities like Ostia and Alexandria, foreign superstitions mingled with Roman ones. Egyptian beliefs about names being tied to immortality only deepened Roman anxieties. Jewish and early Christian customs added new layers of caution. To a Roman merchant navigating this spiritual marketplace, it made sense to default to silence rather than risk a supernatural breach. Some might wonder, how did the grief function in a world where names couldn't be spoken? The answer lies in action, not words. The Romans believed in pietas, a kind of dutiful respect. Honoring the dead meant maintaining their tombs, lighting oil lamps, pouring wine, and tending altars. It meant living well enough that the spirit had no reason to return. But it did not mean calling them by name in a crowded street or during a transaction. That was not grief. That was invitation. There are accounts, recorded in private letters, scratched in the walls, murmured in household stories, of what happened when this rule was broken. A man speaks his dead brother's name after a toast, and that night his sleep is invaded by choking dreams. A woman cries out the name of her dead son during childbirth and dies the next morning. These are not official records. They are whispers. But in ancient Rome, it was often the whispers that survived longest. And so, the merchant learned. Speak of the dead if you must, but never name them. Memory is safe. Names are not. Grieve in silence. Burn the incense. Pour the wine. And move forward with your accounts balanced and your tongue cautious. Because in a world where death waited in courtyards, beneath beds, in the mouths of crows, and the rustling of fig trees, sometimes the most powerful protection was the thing left unsaid. The elderly woman who hired a curse tablet scribe. When you are old in a world without mercy, you don't pray for peace. You bargain for survival. That's the truth, hidden beneath the worn sandals and weathered faces of ancient cities. In the Roman Empire, especially during its shadowed centuries, age brought more than wisdom. It brought fear of illness, of irrelevance, of death. And for one woman, her name now lost to ash and time, fear turned to action. She didn't go to a healer. She didn't go to a temple. She went to a scribe, but not the kind who wrote love letters or legal contracts. This man sat behind a curtain in the back of a marketplace stall, surrounded by melted lead, carved bone, and clay soaked in goat's blood. He was a cursed tablet scribe, one of many who quietly did the work no priest would touch. And she had a request. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want wealth. She wanted life. More of it. A little longer. Just enough to tip the scale. She was sick. Perhaps with fever. Perhaps with something more persistent. And she believed the spirits of the underworld had begun to notice her. That the gates were creaking open. That the river across death's threshold had begun to whisper her name. But in Roman superstition, there was a loophole written not in sacred text, but in folk belief and whispered curses. Death, some believed, could be redirected, diverted. If a spirit came to claim you and instead found another name, written, sealed, and properly buried in ritualized fashion, perhaps the gods below would be appeased. Perhaps they'd take that other soul instead. So she brought the names, 3 of them, rivals, neighbors, a son's greedy wife. No one knows. But she gave the scribe the full names, as was required, and the offenses they'd committed. Even petty slights became fuel, because the underworld didn't care about justice. It cared about sacrifice. The scribe, following tradition, carved the names into a small lead tablet, folded it tightly, and drove an iron nail through its center. Then, as was common practice, it was handed to a temple servant or discreet gravedigger, someone who would deliver it to a fresh corpse or lower it into a tomb. The idea was simple. Send the curse into the underworld along with the dead. Let the spirits below read it and act. This wasn't uncommon. Thousands of such tablets have been unearthed across the ancient world, from Britain to Carthage, from underground crypts to bathhouse drains. Many target thieves, business competitors, or unfaithful lovers. But this woman's curse was different. She wasn't angry. She was terrified. In her words, scratched and trembling script by someone else, she asked the chthonic gods to drag these souls in my place, to lift my illness and anchor it to theirs, and to tie my years to the dead weight of their names. It is a raw, haunting plea, and it reveals just how desperate survival could become in a time without medicine, without certainty, where even the old believed they could barter life itself with lead, blood, and a name. The practice of curse tablets, called desperation, was technically illegal, even frowned upon by the official Roman religion, but no one enforced it. Not really, because even senators, governors, and priests were known to visit these scribes under cover of night. Belief in the power of names, in the precision of written wrath, was too widespread. You didn't have to believe in the gods to believe in fear, and fear, for the elderly, was constant. Age was not respected as it is idealized in modern stories. It was a burden, a liability. Old women were often ridiculed, called witches, accused of theft, suspected of curses themselves. To live long was not always a blessing. It was often a threat to others, and so she preempted that judgment. She fought back, not with poison, not with prayers, but with a name etched in soft metal and a hope buried as 6 feet below. Did it work? Of course, we got to know, but stories spread. The woman, according to fragmented local legend, recovered, at least for a time. The fever lifted. Her neighbors grew distant. Some grew sick. One reportedly died. Whether that was coincidence or curse didn't matter. What mattered is that she lived, and that's the chilling part. Not just that someone would pay to curse another, but that they would do it, not out of hatred, but out of survival. That somewhere in the faded corners of the ancient world, someone truly believed that death could be misdirected, that fate could be rewritten, line by line, on a slab of lead. The power of a curse tablet wasn't just in the ritual, it was in belief. The belief that words had weight, that names could bind souls, that the act of writing wasn't just record, it was invocation, that to name your enemy was to make them vulnerable, that the gods of the underworld listened, not to tears, but to instructions, and so she instructed them, with precision, with desperation, with hope sharpened into ink. She didn't know if she was damning innocent people. She didn't care. When your breath becomes shallow, when your bones ache in the morning, when death sits beside your bed like a guest who hasn't been fed, you don't ask who deserves what. You ask only who will go instead. And maybe that is the darkest truth of all, that survival in its rawest form doesn't always wear a white robe. Sometimes it hunches over a tablet of lead. Sometimes it pays in coin and blood. And sometimes it asks the gods of death to read a name and take it instead. The servant who faked death to trick the spirits. She lay still beneath a linen sheet, the smell of vinegar and rosemary thick in the air. Her pulse raced beneath her ribs, but her breath was shallow, practiced, silent. Around her, 3 other servants whispered prayers in half-remembered Latin, tossing ashes across the doorway and muttering the words they had heard old women say during real funerals. In the dark corners of that crumbling estate, they weren't preparing for a burial. They were staging a deception, because death was coming. Not the metaphorical kind, not a warning or a feeling. Real death. The kind that moved through rooms without knocking, that bloated the face and blackened the veins, that took your name and made it unrecognizable by morning. The plague had reached the village below just 4 days earlier. Chickens lay untouched in the dust. Church bells didn't ring anymore. 2 of the housemaids were already dead. The cook had vanished, and now the young scullery servant, barely 16, was coughing, feverish, cursed, or so she believed. But instead of waiting for the sickness to claim her, she and the others made a choice that defied every law of heaven and empire. They would fake her death, not to fool the doctors or escape servitude, but to trick the spirits themselves, to confuse fate, to make death believe it had already taken its due. This wasn't superstition born of ignorance. It was ritual born of desperation. In parts of medieval Europe, especially in rural estates and plague-struck hamlets, there was a secret practice whispered through generations of pre-death. It was the belief that by undergoing the rites of burial before illness truly took hold, one could symbolically die, and therefore be overlooked by the reaper. If death was a spirit with a list, the theory went, then crossing your name off early could save your soul, or at least buy you time. So the servants did what they could. They wrapped her arms in twine, smeared her face with ash, and tied a copper coin under her tongue. They laid herbs across her chest, some for scent, others for protection. Salt was poured around her body in a ring. She was not allowed to speak, not allowed to open her eyes. For the next 12 hours, she would remain a corpse in the eyes of both gods and demons. And if the spell held, she might live. This wasn't a one-off tale. Archaeological and textual fragments point to a haunting truth. These rituals, though rare, truly existed. In a 14th century parish record from outside Marseille, a priest angrily, vehemently denounces the blasphemous rites of the unwashed, who play dead to mislead the Lord's judgment. In a marginal note beside a plague ledger from Prague, a scribe recounts a house where a boy was buried alive by his kin, thinking him dead. He returned on the seventh day, hungry and pale, claiming he had seen angels too afraid to touch him. Whether literal or myth, the pattern is clear. People acted dead, hoping fate would pass them by. One excavation in East Anglia uncovered a strange grave, shallow, barely 2 feet deep, with no coffin, no marker, and a skeleton with arms folded incorrectly, palms downward instead of skyward. Around the body were objects not typically found in peasant burials. A wooden token carved with symbols not of Christianity, but of old pagan runes. The conclusion: the person had been laid as a decoy, not honored but hidden. In many of these rites, faking death wasn't just about lying still, it meant letting go. The person had to believe, even briefly, that they were no longer part of the world, that their name, their voice, even their memories had already crossed into the next realm. Only then would the spirits pass over without recognizing the soul they came to claim, and it was dangerous. Some who faked death were never allowed to return. In one Saxon village, a girl who performed the ritual during a pox outbreak survived. But when she tried to re-enter society, the townspeople declared her cursed. She was exiled. Another tale from Naples speaks of a woman whose family buried her in a barn to avoid drawing the plague's attention. She awoke alone 3 days later, surrounded by rotting food offerings. She lived, but never spoke again. Still, the ritual persisted, because for servants, especially the poorest, the youngest, the least seen, there was no healer, no cure, no savior. When death came, it came silently, and it took quickly. To stage a fake funeral was not vanity, it was strategy, a final trembling attempt to outwit the inevitable. And even if it didn't work, it gave them something the world refused them in life: control. Control over their body, control over their story, control over the moment that would otherwise be stolen from them without warning. The young servant in that candlelit room didn't die that night. Whether the fever broke on its own or the spirits truly passed over her, no one knows. But the next morning, she opened her eyes. The others wept, not in mourning, but in awe. She lived, and she was changed. For the rest of her years, it's said, she refused to sleep indoors. She ate only cold bread. She wore no color. To some, she was a miracle. To others, a warning. A girl who had tricked death, and therefore was marked by it forever. The fake funeral may have ended, but the illusion never quite lifted. She had walked the edge of the grave and returned, and in doing so she became more than servant. She became a ghost in reverse. The street vendor who burned bread at dawn to appease the lares before the sun's first light kissed the rooftops of ancient Rome, before the noise of carts and shouting vendors filled the winding streets, there was a ritual that unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, an act so common and yet so deeply spiritual, it stitched together the very fabric of daily survival. In a cramped tenement, tucked between the tabernae and bustling alleyways, a lone street vendor crouched beside a small blackened altar. It wasn't grand. It wasn't adorned with gold or fine marble. It was made of clay, soot-streaked, tucked near the hearth or doorway, where the household spirits, the Lars, were believed to live, and in the vendor's hand, a crust of stale bread, hardened from yesterday's sale, saved not for eating, but for burning. This wasn't waste. It wasn't superstition. It was a sacred exchange. One charred piece of bread, one whispered prayer in return for protection. In a city where plague, fire, or a single poor day of trade could unravel an entire family's fate. These burnt offerings were the only insurance a poor man could afford. And so he lit the flame, let the smoke rise, and hoped that today the Lars would be pleased. The Lars were not distant, untouchable gods like Jupiter or Mars. They were domestic, intimate, guardian spirits that lived inside every Roman home, stall, and alleyway. They protected boundaries, watched over thresholds, kept the spirits of ancestors and the shadows of the underworld at bay. Their power was quiet, but constant, and to ignore them was to tempt misfortune. It was said that the Lairs saw everything. They dwelled in the walls. They heard every cough in the night, every creak of a floorboard. They knew when food was short. They knew when sickness entered through the cracks, and they expected respect. For Rome's lower classes, especially street vendors, there was little else to rely on. The state did not provide. The temples were grand, yes, but far. The priests were busy with festivals and patrons of wealth, but the Lars, they were here, right here, watching, waiting, and they could be appeased with the simplest of things: bread crusts, wine dregs, a sliver of meat fat, anything that acknowledged their presence. Every morning, before setting up his stall, a vendor would perform this small rite. Burnt bread wasn't just symbolic, bread was life. To sacrifice it was to offer sustenance, something earned with sweat, traded with effort. It was a meaningful gift, and the act of burning it was just as crucial. The smoke carried the essence to the spirit world, a visible sign of reverence. In a way, it was a conversation. I have so little, but I share it with you. Please keep death from my door. In excavated homes of Pompeii and Herculaneum, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of lararia, small household shrines often found in kitchens or near entrances. Many show signs of repeated use. Some bear scorch marks and traces of burned grain or ash, suggesting that offerings like bread were not just occasional, but routine, daily, ritualistic. The rhythms of life were tied to fire, smoke, and silent offerings. This tradition was so deeply ingrained that even Roman literature touches on it. Writers like Plautus and Horace make passing references to household rituals, the smell of burnt offerings, the fear of offending spirits. In poorer districts, these acts were often performed without fanfare. No grand hymns or processions, just a flicker of flame, a murmur, a glance to the sky, and then business as usual. A wooden cart rolled out, grapes, olives, or loaves laid out on rough boards, and a heart that beat a little steadier, believing the family might be spared the misfortune just for one more day. But the belief carried weight. It wasn't just personal, it was communal. If a neighbor didn't burn bread and a death followed, people noticed. If your offerings were too small or inconsistent, and your child took ill, whispers began. The Lairs were offended. Ritual behavior became a kind of social contract. A street's well-being was tied to its devotion. Entire blocks might burn together or survive together. There are also darker records, stories of vendors who stopped giving offerings out of arrogance, desperation, or skepticism, only to find themselves struck by sudden calamity: fire in the bread oven, illness in the home, a missing child. To the ancient Roman mind, these weren't coincidences. They were retributions, reminders that even the smallest spirits were not to be forgotten. But this wasn't simply about fear. It was about control. In a world without medicine, without reliable sanitation, without guarantees of income, the ritual gave people something to hold on to, a role to play in their own fate. When you burned bread for the Lares, you didn't feel helpless. You felt connected to your ancestors, to the unseen, to the rhythm of the city itself. And even in death, the ritual persisted. Some Roman tomb inscriptions request continued offerings of bread or wine to be made in their name, so that the soul might rest peacefully and the family might remain under divine protection. The burning of bread was not just a mourning habit. It was a link between the living and the dead, between the seen and the invisible. So picture that street vendor again, rising in the chill before sunrise, lighting his modest flame, placing the hardened crust into the fire, watching it blacken, then vanish, and then stepping into the world to sell, to struggle, to hope. Behind him, the smoke lingers, thin but defiant, a signal to the spirits. We remember, we still believe, please protect us. In that simple act, repeated thousands of times across generations, is the echo of a civilization's most human need: to be seen, to be safe, to be spared, and all it cost was a crust of bread. The orphan who dressed like a priest to fool the gods, he was no taller than a prayer bench, and had eyes in eyes too old for his face. The streets had emptied weeks ago, the bells long silenced, and the smell of smoke and sickness clung to the wind like a second skin. The boy had no name anymore, no one left to say it, just a fragment of cloth draped over his shoulders, a priest's stole, frayed, stained, far too long for his frame. He walked slowly, deliberately, muttering Latin phrases he didn't fully understand, crossing himself at every corner. His voice was soft, broken, and trembling, but it wasn't for others. It was for the spirits, for death, for the thing that walked between doors and stole breath from sleeping mouths. He wasn't playing dress-up. He was making a bargain with the invisible. In the plague-ravaged cities of late medieval Europe, when half the population vanished in months, when carts of corpses became as common as market bean wagons, children were often left behind. Parents died suddenly. Monasteries closed their doors. Orphaned and unseen, these children learned quickly that the world did not protect the voiceless. So some of them decided to trick the world, or something deeper than the world. Historical accounts whisper about it, never too loud, as if afraid to disturb what they describe. Figures of children wrapped in torn liturgical garments, barefoot and hollow-eyed, wandering like echoes through the ruins of towns. They carried wooden crosses. They sang broken hymns. They copied the movements of monks they once watched from the back pews, and when asked if anyone dared, they'd say softly, "The spirits don't take the holy." It was a logic born from despair. In that age, death was not merely biological. It was personal. It had eyes, intent, patterns. It moved in silence, but it chose, and belief shaped survival. The pure, the sacred, the holy. These were thought to be immune. Priests died, yes, but rarely early. Clergy were seen as thresholds between worlds. Some people thought spirits could not cross their shadows. So what if a child, unwanted and unprotected, became a shadow of that role? The boy wasn't alone in the act. In city chronicles from Venice, cryptic entries describe children wandering in robes and uttering psalms in ruined chapels. In Nuremberg, rumors spread of a boy who slept inside a cathedral's apse for 30 nights untouched, while others around him died screaming. Even in London's plague years, a physician's notes mention a strange host of chanting boys appearing near hospitals, mistaken for choir novices, only to vanish before dawn. They weren't choir boys. They were survivors, alone, terrified, and clever. The robes they wore were often stolen, lifted from abandoned churches, taken from the dead. Sometimes they fashioned garments from bed linens, dyed them with ash or wine, anything to mimic sacred vestments. They didn't need to be accurate. They just needed to be convincing enough for the spirits. Some drew chalk crosses on their foreheads. Others fashioned crude mitres from paper or wore rosaries made from bones. They avoided meat, slept on stone, sang dirges by heart. These weren't games. They were rituals, crafted by desperation, polished by repetition, and performed with the blind hope that belief might outweigh blood. And strangely, it sometimes worked. Whether through chance, early immunity, or sheer isolation, some of these children survived entire waves of plague untouched. When towns repopulated, they were discovered, living in ruins, still dressed as clergy, still whispering liturgy to empty pews. Some were taken in and trained as actual priests. Others were rejected, called blasphemers or witches. But a few simply vanished, having already shaped themselves into ghosts of their own choosing. We often ask how children process trauma. The medieval orphan didn't have therapy. He had silence, ritual, imitation. And when the world fell apart, when his mother coughed blood and his father stopped moving, he reached for the only image of immunity he'd ever seen: the priest, the untouchable, the chosen. So he became it, not to lead others, but to vanish from the radar of death itself. This act wasn't insanity. It was brilliance under pressure, a child's mind weaponizing belief. And perhaps, in the twisted logic of a world gone mad, it was enough. In their eyes, death had rules, and if death obeyed, then those who wore the right symbols could escape it. It wasn't always successful. Some were found days later, curled beneath church altars, silent forever. But their attempts left behind a legacy of eerie reverence. Even among adults, the idea grew that disguise, spiritual disguise, might repel fate, that holiness, or the illusion of it, might confuse the forces that chose who lived and who died. Today, this story lives mostly in folklore, blurred by centuries of retelling. We say they dress like priests, as if it was mimicry, but it wasn't. It was identity theft on a metaphysical level. It was a child reaching into the fire and pretending to be the flame, and somewhere, perhaps in the corners of cracked church walls, or beneath the dust of a long-lost nave, the memory of those children still lingers. Tiny robes, bare feet, eyes wide, not with innocence, but with strategy. They didn't want to be saved. They just didn't want to be seen, because in that time, being visible meant being taken. But holiness was invisible. So the next time you pass an old church and feel a chill in the air, remember the orphan who walked its aisles not to find God, but to become just holy enough to fool the gods into leaving him behind. The actress who carried snakeskins for immortality. In the oil-lit dressing chambers behind Roman amphitheaters, beneath the flicker of flame and the perfume of sweat and crushed herbs, there lived a quiet superstition whispered from one performer to the next. Carry the skin of a snake, and you might just survive the night. Not because it was fashionable, not because it was sacred, but because it was magic, ancient, writhing, regenerative. And for the actress who danced too close to death every time she stepped onto the stage, that brittle fragment of shed snakeskin could mean the difference between being remembered or buried. To us, performance is art, but in ancient Rome, performance was risk. Women who acted, especially in tragedies, were expected to mimic death, collapse in violence, or stand inches from fire and blade for the delight of the audience. They performed on rickety scaffolds amid wild animals, or surrounded by collapsing stage props rigged with primitive machinery. It wasn't rare for a performance to end with a real injury, or worse, The line between story and sacrifice was razor thin, and so these actresses sought protection not in armor or weapons, but in charms sewn into their clothing, and above all others they turned to the serpent. To the Roman mind, snakes were not merely animals, they were mystical symbols of immortality. They shed their skin, emerging smooth, glistening, alive. It was not decay, it was renewal. In Roman religion and folklore, this act of transformation was interpreted as a kind of divine recycling. To possess the skin of a snake was to hold a fragment of life that refused to end. This belief did not emerge in isolation. The cult of Asclepius, the god of healing, featured sacred serpents that slithered freely through temple grounds. His staff, wrapped with a coiled snake, remains a medical symbol even today. But among performers, the snake represented something more personal. It was a stand-in for survival, for slipping through danger, for living again, even when the world had already started mourning. Actresses would hide pieces of shed snakeskin in their sandals beneath their breastbands, or even braided into their hair. It was a secret not spoken of openly, for fear of being mocked, or worse, of the charm losing its potency, but it spread through performer circles rapidly. From the seasoned star of the Roman stage to the youngest chorus girl, the ritual became second nature. Some carried entire curled skins in pouches. Others burned them in small bowls before the show, breathing in the ashes as a kind of warding breath. There are scattered references to this in Roman literature. Pliny the Elder writes in his Natural History of how snakeskin could ward off fatal illness, purify the body, and protect against unknown forces. Even more fascinating is his suggestion that the skin, when worn or carried, offered a kind of resistance to poisons and spiritual corruption, precisely the kind of unseen doom that actresses feared most. After all, not all their enemies were visible. A jealous rival could slip something into a drink. An angry patron could curse a performance. A poorly handled prop could collapse an entire scene. For actresses, the body was everything. It was their canvas, their tool, their trap. They were revered on stage and reviled of it, considered little better than prostitutes by polite society. Yet they held the attention of thousands, and they knew that their youth, their beauty, their very lives could be stolen in a moment by a snapped rope or a falling beam. So they turned to what was oldest and most enduring in nature, the serpent that slithered through myth and medicine alike. Even funerary records offer clues. Archaeologists have discovered tombs of entertainers, mostly women, that contain coiled snakeskin fragments, folded into scraps of cloth, sealed with wax. In one particularly well-preserved site outside Pompeii, the skeleton of a young performer was found buried with small leather slippers. Hidden beneath the sole of one, tucked in with precision, was a brittle sliver of snakeskin. She had died in her teens, and even in death her charm remained with her, pressed beneath the foot that had once danced across the blood-washed boards of a Roman stage. This wasn't merely about physical safety. It was spiritual armor, a prayer wrapped in instinct, a way for the most vulnerable women in Roman society to reclaim a fragment of control over their fate. Many believed that if they died while carrying the snakeskin, their soul could regenerate in the next life, that just as the snake slipped free of its old shell, they too might shed death and return, reborn, remembered, radiant. Some even believed the skin could absorb pain or bad luck, that after a particularly dangerous performance, the charm should be burned and replaced, as if it had taken the hit on behalf of the wearer. This belief wasn't symbolic. It was lived, rehearsed, whispered before every show like a prayer, because each time an actress stepped before the crowd, she wasn't just entertaining, she was gambling, and the stakes were her own blood. In this ancient world, where women's lives were short, brutal, and disposable, where applause could turn to condemnation in a single breath, the snakeskin became something precious, more than a superstition. It was inheritance, resistance, a symbol of transformation in a culture that tried to trap women in a single role. So when the curtain rose and the actress stepped forward, painted in myth, surrounded by firelight and cloaked in silk, remember what she carried hidden near her heart: a scrap of snake, a secret pact, a sliver of immortality, not just to survive the show, but to defy every force that wanted her forgotten. The carpenter who slept with one eye opened during Saturnalia. There was a saying whispered in the darker corners of Roman winter: the gods are drunk and the dead are listening. It wasn't a proverb, it was a warning that came alive during one of Rome's wildest festivals, Saturnalia, a time when the city upended its own rules. Slaves dined like masters, masters served like servants, laws bent, roles reversed, and the thin, fragile boundary between the living and the dead was believed to fray just enough for things to slip through. And in the middle of all that chaos, there was a carpenter, not a nobleman, not a priest, just a man with calloused hands, a crooked back, and enough fear to keep him awake for 7 nights straight, because he believed, like many did quietly, that Saturnalia wasn't just for celebration. It was a test, a ritual of inversion, not for joy, but for spiritual distraction. While Rome danced and drank and broke its own order, darker things moved beneath the surface. He had seen it once, years ago. A neighbor's child, healthy and laughing, one night, dead by morning. No fever, no wound, just gone. And it had happened during Saturnalia. The priest said it was coincidence, but the old women, the ones who never looked you in the eye, said otherwise. They said the spirits that normally respected rules grew curious when Rome didn't have any. They said mischief wasn't just for mortals, that during this festival the gates below loosened their hinges, and the shadows walked. So this carpenter made a choice. Each winter, as Saturnalia approached, he sealed his door with thorns and black resin. He slept sitting up, tools within reach, a dagger beneath his straw mattress. Oil lamps stayed lit until the wick dissolved into black smoke, and he forced himself to sleep with only one eye closed, not out of superstition, but out of memory. You see, in Roman belief, especially among the working class and rural poor, death wasn't always majestic or symbolic. Sometimes it was opportunistic. It looked for chaos. It thrived in inversion. And during Saturnalia, when the world turned upside down, they believed death no longer followed the rules. It could visit the strong, the young, the untouched, without warning, without mercy. There were stories, too many to ignore. A baker found frozen in the middle of the road, eyes wide, no wound. A pregnant woman who screamed during the night and never woke. A blind man who said he saw figures dancing through the smoke, only to drop dead days later, each tale ending the same way. It happened during Saturnalia. And the carpenter, for all his logic, had grown up with these stories. He'd buried friends without explanation. He'd seen livestock refuse to enter homes on festival nights. He once found a trail of childlike footprints around his house in fresh snow, though no child lived nearby. He didn't pretend to understand the why. He just prepared for the when. While the city poured wine and crowned mock kings in jest, he muttered old prayers, prayers not found in temples, but handed down by frightened grandmothers. He burned herbs, not for fragrance, but for warning. If the scent shifted in the wrong direction, if the flame flickered against the wind, he didn't sleep at all. Historians often describe Fiesida Saturnalia as a joyous celebration of freedom, laughter, and release. And that's true on the surface. But peel back the mask and you'll find fear laced into every tradition. Why else the sudden generosity, the gifts, the flattery of servants, the singing in streets where silence usually reigned? It wasn't just joy, it was appeasement, as if the people were trying to distract something watching from the edge, as if chaos was a sacrifice offered to keep worse things at bay. And so, the carpenter didn't laugh, he didn't sing, he watched. His children thought him paranoid, his neighbors pitied him, but every year, when the fires burned too low and the wind howled too loud, someone else in the district would fall ill, or vanish, or simply be found with breathless lips and fingers curled around the air. He didn't think himself wise, he didn't think himself chosen, he just wanted to see the sunrise one more time. And so when others drank, he listened. When others danced, he held still. And when others slept, he watched the shadows move across the wall and waited to see if they would stop. We think of superstition as ignorance, but what if it's memory? What if it's just the residue of things once seen, once felt, once feared? The carpenter didn't need books or philosophers. He needed certainty, and in the absence of that, he built a ritual, not one of joy, but of vigilance, because he knew that sometimes the price of survival was exhaustion. And what if he was right? What if, in the city's loudest moments, when roles reversed and logic slipped, some spirit did reach out, but found a man who didn't close both eyes, a man who dared to say, "Not this house, not this time," and so he survived, year after year, not with spells, not with sacrifice, but with stubbornness, with wakefulness, with a simple aching decision to never look away. The slave woman who drew eyes on her hands before giving birth. She was no one, not in the records, not in the prayers, no name on a family tree, no father to speak for her, no midwife who would remember her face. She was a slave, property of a Roman household, used, ordered, exhausted. And now she was about to give birth, but before the first cry, before the pain that bent her spine and soaked her robe in blood, before the moment that could enter, as it had ended so many women before her, she reached for a piece of crushed charcoal, and with trembling fingers, she drew a single eye into the center of her palm, then another, 2 black eyes, simple and crude, staring outward, not art, a defense, a silent plea in the language of ancient fear. Because in Rome, childbirth was not a miracle, it was a gamble. For free women, even noble ones, childbirth was dangerous. For slaves, it was brutal. There were no physicians, no sterile tools, no ceremony, just rushes and cloth and blood. And when things went wrong, though they didn't call it tragedy, they called it cost. So, across the Roman Empire, women, especially enslaved women, turned to what little they had left. Symbols. The eye motif had existed long before Rome, found in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, etched on pottery, scratched into walls, painted on amulets. The belief was simple. The evil eye could kill, but the watching eye could protect, inverting the gaze, turning danger back on itself. In Roman times, this evolved into a common practice among the desperate and unseen. Drawn eyes on doors, beds, even bodies. And for women about to give birth, especially in slavery, the eyes were drawn on hands, because the hands would be the last to touch life before death came. If death saw it was being watched, it might hesitate. Archaeological finds across Roman-era dwellings have unearthed crude drawings of eyes not only on walls, but on birth stools, charms, and even small carved stones placed beneath mattresses. In some burial sites, female skeletons are found with wrists wrapped in cloth bearing ink stains, no longer readable, but placed where the drawn eyes would have been. In households wealthy enough to own many slaves, it was common to deny enslaved women any kind of formal birth ritual. They were expected to continue working until their labor began, and if they died, their infants were often handed to wet nurses or left to fate. But among themselves, the slave women remembered the old ways, ways whispered across continents. The eye wasn't Roman. It was older than empire. It came from Nubia, from Gaul, from Persia, from places where spirits walked close during childbirth, places where death wasn't fought with swords, but with symbols. To draw an eye was to declare that you knew death was watching, and that you were watching back. It was, in many ways, the only act of agency the woman had left. Some women added red pigment, mixing it with crushed herbs or their own blood. Some added protective sigils around the eye. A few, those who had seen too many deaths, painted 6 or 8 eyes across their forearms and wrists, a wall of vision, not to scare away men, to scare away the spirits who came for mothers, to turn childbirth from a silent surrender into a visual warning. A mosaic in a ruined villa near Pompeii shows a woman in labor surrounded by attendants, and though it's subtle, if you look closely, one of the attendants has dark markings on her hand, not jewelry, not paint, eyes watching. The belief spread beyond Rome. In some Greco-Roman texts, birth amulets are described as being marked by gaze, and midwives speak of burning the eye into the hand to hold open the soul's gate. What they meant is still debated, but for those women, no theory mattered. Only survival did, and these rituals weren't just for protection, they were a defiance. In a society where a slave's pain meant nothing, where her body was a tool and her death an inconvenience, the drawing of an eye was a rebellion, a way of saying, you may own my body, but you do not own my fate. The woman who drew the eyes before giving birth may not have survived. Statistically, she probably didn't, but what she did survive, at least for a moment, was erasure, because the marks she left were not just for protection, they were for memory. She knew no poet would write of her labor, no historian would record the moment she screamed, no marble bust would carry her likeness, so she gave herself watchers, witnesses, even if they were made of ink and fear. In the empire that crushed names beneath conquest and called suffering duty, she stared back. Through 2 black circles on trembling hands, she looked at the gods, at the lords, at death itself, and said, you see me. That was all she had, and in that moment it was enough. The soldier who buried his nails under the parade ground. He stood at the edge of the parade ground, silent, still, the morning mist clinging to his armor like a second skin. Around him, the barracks were stirring, clanking iron, shouted orders, the rhythmic slap of leather sandals on packed earth. But he wasn't moving, not yet. In his hand, wrapped in a small scrap of linen, were the fragments of himself, clipped fingernails, strands of hair, the cast-offs of his own body. They seemed meaningless, even laughable to a passing eye, but for this Roman soldier they were sacred, vital, the pieces that, if left unburied, might one day be stolen, not by thieves, but by forces older and darker than Rome itself. And so, before he drilled, before he marched, before he bled, he dug a small hole, barely 2 fingers deep, pressed into the corner of the campus, the military training ground. Into it he placed his fingernails and hair, then covered them with earth, pressed flat by his palm. A whispered breath, may be a prayer, not to Mars, not to Jupiter, but to the nameless powers beneath the ground, the ones who watched, the ones who sometimes called. This strange and intimate ritual was not officially sanctioned by the Roman military, yet evidence of it persists in the margins of their history. Among the rank and file soldiers, the legionaries who marched thousands of miles, who dug trenches, who fought and died in foreign lands, folk beliefs and private rituals often flourished in the shadows of imperial doctrine. The bearing of nails and hair beneath parade grounds was one such act, passed not in edicts or scrolls, but in murmurs between comrades. It was a protective magic, a binding spell, a way to anchor the self to the earth, so the soul wouldn't drift when the chaos of battle came. To understand this ritual, you must understand how a Roman soldier viewed the world. He was not simply muscle in service of empire. He was a soul in constant peril. Battle wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Death didn't come only from blades, it came from curses, from the manes, the spirits of the dead, from restless gods, jealous spirits, and echoes of unfinished business. In the frenzy of war, a man could be called, his soul yanked from his body, confused, pulled by forces he could neither see nor fight. To prevent this, he had to stay here, grounded, whole. Hair and nails were seen as powerful links to the self, fragments that, if lost, could become tools for magic. Witches were known to use such pieces in binding curses, rituals of control, even death spells. But in the hands of the soldier, they became a shield. When buried beneath the earth, especially beneath a place where his feet would strike daily, where his sweat and blood would soak the dust, they acted as a spiritual anchor. The logic was simple, but haunting. If part of him was already buried here, then the rest of him could not be taken elsewhere. Archaeologists have uncovered curious traces of this ritual, small bundles of human hair and nail fragments buried beneath ancient Roman encampments, especially near parade grounds or corners of training fields. Inscriptions and graffiti from Hadrian's Wall to the Danubian frontier make oblique references. "My spirit stays where my feet strike," reads one etched message. Another says, "I buried myself so no god could claim me whole." These weren't the expressions of priests. These were the beliefs of scared, hardened men who had seen death too many times to leave anything to chance. It's easy to forget how fragile the Roman soldier's psyche truly was. Despite the discipline, the armor, the rigorous training, most were young, many were foreign, few had families with them. They were expendable tools in the eyes of the state, but still desperately human in the quiet moments before battle. And in those moments, strange rituals took root. Some would whisper to their buried nail clippings before marching. Others avoided walking directly over the spot where they had hidden their hair, treating it like a sacred threshold. A few carried soil from the parade ground into battle, hoping the connection would prevent them from being spiritually severed from the earth. And still others believed that if they died in battle, the buried fragments might deceive the spirits of the dead, tricking them into thinking the soul remained with the buried hair, buying just enough time for the lairs or manes of home to intervene and guide them safely to the afterlife. There's even evidence that this belief was strong enough to influence behavior in camp. Soldiers whose nails or hair were accidentally burned or discarded would sometimes become convinced that they were unbound, vulnerable to curses or death. Such a man might seek out a medicus for reassurance, or worse, visit a local cunning woman or seer in secret, hoping to restore the spiritual tether. Fear of being unanchored, of having the soul drift, was as terrifying as the enemy's sword. What's remarkable is how this belief lived alongside Rome's state religion. Officially, the gods of war were invoked through ceremonies, sacrifices, banners, and orations. But in the shadows, at the margins of the parade ground, a soldier performed his own rite, quieter, older, more personal. Rome might own his armor, his sword, even his life, but this small ritual, this was his. No centurion commanded it. No officer punished its neglect. It existed in the space where fear meets faith. So imagine him again, the soldier, alone before the dawn, kneeling over a small patch of dirt, whispering words his grandfather taught him. The others are stretching, polishing their weapons, talking of drills and rations, but he is still, focused. He buries his hair, presses it deep, and when he stands, he is not just a body in armor. He is anchored, watched, protected, and ready to bleed without being lost. Because war, to the Roman soldier, was not just a struggle of empires, it was a struggle to remain whole. And sometimes, to survive the gods, a man had to bury a piece of himself before the world tried to take it all. The dancer who ate dried mice to cure sickness. She danced because her body would not stop shaking. Her legs twitched, her spine arched, and her breath came in ragged, frantic bursts. But this was no performance, no music, no applause, only mud beneath her feet, straw in her hair, and the eyes of her neighbors watching in horror and prayer. In the corners of the village square, people whispered she was possessed. Others said she was cursed. But her grandmother, wrinkled, silent, and still tethered to the ways older than the church, knew what needed to be done. And so, as the girl convulsed in the dirt, she was handed a pouch. Inside it, the brittle remains of a dried mouse, hollow bones, papery skin, death made into medicine. She wept as she chewed, and the village crossed themselves, hoping it wasn't too late. In the medieval world, sickness wasn't just a biological failure. It was spiritual war. Illness, particularly sudden, shaking sicknesses like St. Vitus's dance or the so-called dancing plague, was often believed to be caused by spirits, not metaphorically, literally, night spirits, shadow beings, possessive entities that slipped into the body when the moon was high or when someone fell asleep with their mouth open. And once inside, they did not leave willingly, but certain creatures, it was believed, could take those spirits with them. Mice, for example, small, nocturnal, elusive. Mice were said to run between worlds. They crept along rafters and altar rails, disappearing behind stone and wood like messengers of the beyond. In some regions, people whispered that the mice could carry sickness away if you gave them something to take. But for those already afflicted, there was a darker ritual. You became the mouse. In parts of rural Europe, especially in pockets of France, Bavaria, and Eastern Slavic territories, there are grim folk records and fragmented charms that describe the use of dried mice in desperate cures. Eating one, or grinding it into powder and swallowing it with wine or milk, was thought to trick the sickness. If death had settled in your body, the spirit might follow the mouse back into the underworld, but only if you consumed it, only if the flesh of a death-traveling creature mingled with your own. It was rarely done willingly. Most patients gagged, some refused, but the very fact that the ritual existed and was known by midwives, dancers, and plague doctors alike speaks to the utter desperation of the times, especially for those afflicted by the terrifying phenomenon now known as chorea. Involuntary body movements, tremors, twitching, dancing when no music played. The affliction itself was mysterious, contagious in appearance, and deeply feared. In 1518, a real and terrifying outbreak of this dancing plague struck Strasbourg, and it was not the only time. across medieval Europe, dozens of such outbreaks are recorded. Groups of people, often women, dancing until they collapsed, bled, or died. The explanation? Spirits. The solution? Sometimes dried mice. The dancer was usually a woman. This was no coincidence. Women were seen as spiritually porous, more easily possessed, more vulnerable to the night's touch, and when the shaking began, they weren't rushed to a physician. They were often taken to the edge of the village, given herbs, locked in barns, and sometimes, when nothing else worked, fed mice. The mice had to be specific, not just any dead rodent. It needed to be dried slowly in smoke, never burned, and never killed with metal. Metal, they believed, severed the spirit's thread. But if a mouse died in a trap or of natural causes, it was ripe for ritual. Its remains were stored with grave seriousness, sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes placed in jars beside herbs like mugwort, henbane, or valerian, plants also associated with spirit expulsion. In some rare cases, the ritual was expanded. The afflicted would be placed in a circle of ashes while the dried mouse was consumed. Old prayers would be spoken in reverse. Drums might beat to distract the spirits. The body would be watched, but not touched, for the entire night. If the shaking ceased, it was believed the spirit had been lured out. If not, a second mouse was fed. If the patient died, the spirit had won. Medical records from later centuries dismissed these rituals as absurd, but even as science emerged, echoes of the practice lingered. In certain 17th century apothecary manuals, dried mouse powder was still listed as a remedy for convulsions, seizures, even fevers. The logic may have changed, but the desperation remained. The dancer who ate the mouse didn't know all of this. She only knew her limbs were not her own, that her tongue slurred strange syllables at night, that her breath felt occupied, that every scream from her throat was half hers, half something else's. When the mouse bones crunched between her teeth, she tasted salt, dust, and iron. She vomited, wept, and then, just once, her body stilled, and the village exhaled. Some said she was cured. Others said the spirit had moved on. Still others refused to speak of it at all, but they never forgot. And years later, when another child began twitching at dusk, the old woman returned with another pouch. The ritual would continue, because in a world where medicine had no answers, where spirits were more real than bacteria, the people did what they could with what they had, and sometimes what they had was a mouse, dead, dried, divine, a last desperate bite, to trick death into walking away. The mason who whispered to walls so they'd protect him. In the dust-choked air of a rising Roman wall, where sweat mixed with mortar and every strike of the chisel echoed like a hymn to endurance, there worked a man who did more than build. He whispered. With every brick he set, every stone he shaped, his lips moved in silence, delivering soft, private words into the very bones of the structure, not to mark it, not to claim it, but to awaken it, to protect himself, to give the wall a soul. The Roman mason was not merely a laborer. He was a conjurer of permanence in a world always on the edge of collapse. Temples, aqueducts, villas, fortresses, each was a monument to the empire's need for control over nature, over time, over death. But for those who actually laid the stones, survival wasn't about conquest. It was about respect. The materials they worked with weren't inert. They were listening. Among builders, a quiet belief took hold that a structure could be made to care, that if you treated the stone with reverence, spoke to it, fed it words, coaxed it gently, it would return the favor. It would not fall on you. It would not betray you. It would hold. So before setting a key block or sealing an arch, Some masons would lean in and whisper simple things, protective charms, promises, bargains. Hold fast. I place you with care, so care for me. Let no harm pass through you. Some even recited ancient phrases passed from master to apprentice, half-spoken Latin wrapped in older Etruscan shadows, syllables that meant nothing to outsiders, but everything to the one placing the stone. This wasn't theater, it was ritual. In an age where a single slip could crush a spine or bury a body alive, whispers became insurance. The belief wasn't just that the building would stand, it was that it would remember who made it and why. We know from surviving Roman construction manuals, such as those of Vitruvius, that there were precise instructions for engineering, angles, and measurements. But what they left out were the human customs, habits passed in low voices, never written down for fear they'd be mocked or misused. Archaeological digs have uncovered small inscriptions etched on foundation stones, initials, tiny prayers, even crude drawings of hands or eyes. These were not decoration. They were signatures of trust, tokens of presence. The stone was now aware. Builders feared more than just physical danger. They feared what came after. A building, once finished, could become a trap, a collapsed roof, a crumbling column, or worse, haunted by the death of a fellow worker. If a man died during construction, the wall might be seen as cursed, so masons whispered not just to bless the stones, but to bind their own spirit to it in peace. I leave no ghost behind, one phrase went. Stone, carry my weight, but not my soul. In some regions, especially in the more rural parts of the empire, masons went further. They left offerings hidden within the walls, small coins, hair, or blood drops mixed with the mortar. These were not payments to the gods. They were offerings to the building itself. It was a way of making the wall know them. And what knows you, they believed, might choose not to kill you. This belief wasn't exclusive to Rome. It echoed older Mediterranean traditions, where builders of megaliths and temples treated stone as living flesh. In Etruscan and Greek customs, stone was imbued with spirit, conscious and reactive. Rome inherited that belief, buried it under marble and engineering pride, but among the workers, it never died. There are even stories, apocryphal, whispered down centuries, of masons who returned to the buildings they constructed years later, only to survive fires, earthquakes, or collapses that killed others. They would say, "It remembered me," and others would nod, not in disbelief, but in recognition. They had whispered too. Roman architecture remains, millennia later, one of the empire's most enduring legacies, but behind the arches and facades, there were fingers bleeding into stone, voices murmuring into brick, men who built not just with tools, but with fear, hope, and whispered pacts. They did not expect gratitude. They only wanted to be spared. Imagine a builder placing the final stone in a vault that will stand for 100 generations. Before he lets go, he leans in, touches it with 2 fingers, and says, "Protect what stands beneath you. I give you shape, you give me life." Then he walks away. The wall is quiet. It always was, but it holds. And perhaps, in that moment, something ancient stirs inside the stone, something made not of marble or dust, but of memory. A whisper, echoing forever, locked in lime and shadow. A promise that may still be keeping someone safe, even now.